Aus dem Leben eines Taugenichts, from the life of a good-for-nothing by Eichendorff title, from the life of a worthless person by Joseph von Eichendorff, published by Janus Runa, and the online distributed annotations for transcription. The spelling and punctuation of the original text have been retained. Only obvious printing errors have been corrected. A list of changes made is provided at the end of the text. In the original, blocked text was marked with an equal sign, and text in antique font was marked with an underscore. Chapter 1, the mill wheels buzz, my father's mill wheel roared and boomed merrily once again. Snow dripped busily from the roof. Sparrows chirped and darted around amidst it. I sat on the door threshold, wiping sleep from my eyes. I felt right at ease in the warm sunlight. Then father stepped outside. He had been toiling in the mill since dawn, with his sleep cap on his head. He said to me, "You worthless creature, you're at it again, stretching and yawning, wearing your bones, and leaving all the work to me. I can't keep feeding you here. Spring is knocking at the door. Go out into the world and earn your own bread." "Well," I replied, "if I am indeed a worthless person, that's fine. I'll leave and make my way in the world." In fact, this idea delighted me as it had occurred to me only shortly before to set off on a journey. For I had heard the goldfinch, which sang so sadly by our window in autumn and winter. "Farmer, hire me!" Farmer, hire me! Now joyfully proclaiming from its branch in the beautiful springtime, "Farmer, keep me for your work." So I went back into the house, took my violin, which I played beautifully down from the wall. My father gave me a few coins to take with me as I set off through the long village. I was secretly happy as I saw all my old acquaintances and friends heading out to work on either side of Middingen, ploughing while I strolled into the open world. I bade them farewell proudly and cheerfully from all sides, but no one seemed particularly concerned. It felt like an eternal Sunday in my spirit. Finally, when I reached the open field, I took up my dear violin and played, and sang along the country road. To whom God wishes to grant a favor, sends him off into the wide world. He reveals his wonders to mountains, forests, rivers, and fields. The idle ones who stay at home are not refreshed by dawn's light. They only know the lullabies for children, worries, burdens, and the lack of bread. Mountain brooks leap. The larks flutter high in joy. What should I not sing with them from full throat and fresh chest? Let God alone take care of everything. Brooks, larks, forests, fields, earth, and sky he has also provided for my affairs most capably. As I played, as I looked around, a delightful travel coach drew very close to me, having apparently been following behind for some time without my noticing, as my heart was so full of song. It moved very slowly, and two dignified ladies peered out from the carriage, listening to me sing. One of them was particularly beautiful and younger than the other, but I found both equally pleasing. When I finished singing, the older lady politely asked, "Merry fellow, he knows how to sing quite pretty songs." I wasn't too modest in responding. "My good lady, I could teach him even better ones." She then asked me again, "Where is this traveller headed so early in the morning?" I felt ashamed that I didn't know myself, and boldly answered, "To Vienna." They began speaking to each other in a foreign language that I couldn't understand. The younger woman shook her head several times, while the other laughed continuously and eventually called out to me, "Wait, you don't jump on back. We're headed to Vienna, too. Who could have been happier than me?" I made a bow and leaped out onto the carriage in one bound, gave a loud crack, and off we went flying over the gleaming road as the wind whistled through my hat. As villages, gardens, and church towers disappeared behind me, new villages, castles, and mountains came into view before me, below me, seeds, bushes, and meadows passed in a colourful blur, while countless larks soared above in the clear blue sky. I was ashamed to shout loudly, but deep down inside I cheered, bounced and danced on the carriage seat, almost losing my violin, which I held under my arm. As the sun climbed higher and then heavier white day clouds rose around the horizon, filling the air with a sense of emptiness and stillness over the gently swaying fields of grain. Suddenly, my village, my father, and our mill came back to me how quietly and cool he had been by that shady pond, and how far away everything seemed now. I felt a strange sensation, as if I needed to turn back. I placed my violin between my coat and waistcoat, sat down on the carriage seat filled with thoughts, and fell asleep. When I opened my eyes, the carriage stood still beneath tall lime trees, behind which a broad staircase between columns led to a magnificent castle. Through the trees I could see the towers of Vienna. The ladies seemed to have long since alighted from the carriage, and the horses had been unhitched. I was very startled at being suddenly alone, and quickly sprang into the castle, hearing laughter from upstairs as I did so. This castle bewitched me. First, when I looked around in the vast, cool entrance hall, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned quickly to see a tall gentleman dressed in official attire, with a broad belt of gold and silk hanging down to his hips and a silver-topped staff in his hand. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Eichendorff in my face. I had a hand and an extraordinarily long, curved prince's nose, wide and magnificent like an inflated turkey, asking me what I was doing there. I was completely bewildered and could not produce a word from shock and amazement. Then several servants ran up and down the stairs, saying nothing, but merely looking at me from top to bottom. After that, a chambermaid, as I later learned, approached me directly and said, "You are a charming young man, and Her Majesty would like to know if I wanted to serve as a gardener's apprentice." I reached for my waistcoat. My few coins, God knows, must have fallen out of my pocket while dancing on the wagon, were gone. I had nothing but my violin, for which His Honour, with the cane, as he told me passing by, refused to give me even a single coin. Therefore, in my heart's fear, I told the chambermaid, "Wes," still keeping my eyes half turned towards the unsettling figure that kept walking up and down like a pendulum of a clock tower in the hall, and then majestically and frighteningly emerged from behind. Finally, the gardener arrived, grumbling under his beard about scoundrels and peasant urchins, and led me to the garden while giving me a long lecture along the way, how I should only be fine and sober, not wander aimlessly in the world, avoid unprofitable arts and useless things. Then perhaps one day I could achieve something worthwhile. There were many more very beautiful, well-proportioned, useful lessons, but since then I have almost forgotten everything. Overall, I don't really know how it all came about. I just kept saying yes to everything. It was as if my wings had been soaked with rain. So, thank God I was provided for. Living in the garden was lovely. I had a warm meal every day and more money than I needed for wine, but unfortunately I had a lot of work to do. The temple's arbors and beautiful green paths all pleased me very much. If only I could have quietly strolled around and engaged in reasonable discussions like the lords and ladies who came there every day. Whenever the gardener left and I was alone, I immediately took out my short pipe, sat down and contemplated polite ways to speak with the young, beautiful lady who brought me to the castle. If I were a gentleman and went around with her here, or on sweltering afternoons when everything was so quiet that you could only hear the bees buzzing, I would lie on my back and watch as clouds flew over my village above me, and grasses and flowers moved side to side while thinking of the lady, and often it would happen that the beautiful woman with a guitar or a book walked through the garden in the distance, so still, tall, and kind like an image of an angel. I did not know if I was dreaming or awake. So as I passed by a beautiful villa while working one morning, I hummed to myself wherever I go and look in field and forest and valley, from the mountain to the blue sky, I greet you 1,000 times, fair lady. Then from the dark, cool villa between the half-open shutters and the flowers that stood there, 2 beautiful, young, fresh eyes gleamed out at me. I was so startled that I did not finish the song, but left without looking back. That evening, it being Saturday, I stood in the garden house by the window with my violin, anticipating the coming Sunday, still thinking of those gleaming eyes, when suddenly a maid came gliding through the twilight. She sends you this, fair lady, she said, handing me a bottle of wine. Drink to her health. She winked and was gone as quickly, lizard among the flowers and hedges. I stood for a long time looking at the strange bottle, not knowing what had happened. And after playing merrily on my violin before, I played even more, singing the song of the beautiful lady and fool, along with all my other songs, until all the nightingales awoke and the moon and stars shone over the garden. What a wonderful, beautiful night it was. No one sings at a cradle about what will be. Even a blind hen sometimes finds a grain. He who laughs last laughs best, often comes unexpectedly, man thinks. But God-guided such thoughts ran through my mind as I sat in the garden the following day, playing on my pipe. It almost seemed to me that, after all, I was not a proper fellow. From then on, against my usual habit, I got up very early each day, for the gardener and other workers were stirring. The garden was so beautiful outside. The flowers, fountains, rose bushes, and the whole garden sparkled in the morning sun like a sea of gold and precious stones. In the tall oak alleys it was still so quiet, cool, and reverent, like inside a church. Only the birds flew and pecked at the sand. Right before the castle, just under the windows where the beautiful lady lived, there was a blooming bush. That's where I went every morning, hiding behind the branches to look in through the windows, since I had no courage to show myself outdoors. And every time I saw her, the most beautiful lady, still warm and half asleep in her snow-white dress, stepping out towards the open window. Sometimes she would comb her dark brown hair, letting her lovely eyes wander over the bushes and garden. Sometimes she would bend down to tie the flowers before her window, or pick up her guitar in her white arms and sing along with such enchanting melodies. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Eichendorff. Out in the garden, my heart still turns with sadness whenever a song from those days comes to mind, and it has been long since then. It must have been over a week. But on that one occasion, she was standing at the window again, and everything around was silent when a fatal fly flew into my nose, triggering an endless fit of sneezing. She leaned far out the window, watching me, the poor fellow, hiding behind a bush. I felt ashamed and didn't go back for several days. Finally, I gathered the courage to return, but this time the window remained closed. I sat 4, 5, 6 mornings behind the bush, but she never came back to the window. Time seemed to drag on, so I took a deep breath and decided to walk past the castle every morning, freely and boldly, under all the windows. But the dear, beautiful woman was always absent. A little further along, I would see the other lady at the window. I had never seen her in person before. She was truly beautiful, round and plump, with a proud and splendid air like a tulip. I would always pay her a deep compliment, and she would thank me each time, nodding and blinking her eyes most politely. I believe I once saw the beautiful one standing at her window behind the curtain, peeking out shyly. However, many days passed without me seeing her again. She never came to the garden or the window. The gardener accused me of being a lazy good for nothing, and I was disheartened, my own nose blocking the view as I gazed into the free world beyond. One Sunday afternoon, I lay in the garden, frustrated as I looked at the blue clouds in my pipe, wishing I had chosen a different line of work so that tomorrow wouldn't be another Blue Monday. The other lads were all well dressed and out dancing at nearby venues. There they went, drifting and swaying in the warm air between the houses, their voices mingling with the sound of travelling bands. But I sat like a toad by the edge of a lonely pond in the garden, rocking on my boat, while evening bells from the city echoed over the garden and swans glided slowly by beside me. I felt deathly afraid. As I did, I heard distant voices, lively chatter, and laughter getting closer and closer. Then red and white handkerchiefs, hats, and feathers shone through the green, followed by a bright, light crowd of young men and women from the castle, trotting across the meadow towards me. My 2 ladies were right there in the middle. I stood up and wanted to leave, when the older of the beautiful ladies caught sight of me. "Well, isn't that just lucky?" she exclaimed with a laughing voice. Here is the translation of the text preserved in the name Eichendorff. "Close your eyes," he said. Let's ferry them across the pond to the other shore. The ladies carefully and fearfully climbed into the canoe, one by one, while the gentlemen assisted them, puffing themselves up with bravado on the water. Once they were all seated on the side benches, I pushed off from the shore. One of the young men at the front began to gently rock without noticing. The ladies turned around nervously, some even screaming. The beautiful woman holding a lily sat close to the edge of the small boat, her still smile gazing into the clear waves as they caressed the lily, so that her entire figure was reflected in the water among the clouds and trees, like an angel passing silently through the deep blue heavens. As I looked at her, another of my 2 ladies suddenly struck up a song, asking me to sing for them during the trip. A very slender young man with glasses on his nose, sitting next to her, quickly turned towards her, gently kissed her hand, and said, "Thank you for this meaningful suggestion." A folk song sung by the people in fields and forests is like an alpine rose on the alpine meadow. The wonder horns are just herbariums. It's the soul of the national soul. But I said I didn't know a single song that would be beautiful enough for such lords. The sharp maid of honor standing next to me with a basket full of cups and bottles, whom I had completely overlooked until then, chimed in. But he knows a very pretty little song about a lovely woman. Yes, sing it just as brazenly, the lady retorted immediately. I turned a deep red. Meanwhile, the beautiful woman looked up from the water and fixed her gaze on me, affecting me through my body and soul. Without further hesitation, I seized the moment, grabbed my chest with full breath and desire. Wherever I go and look in fields and forests and valleys, from the mountain down into the meadow, beautiful lady of high stature, I greet you 1,000 times. In my garden I find many flowers beautiful and delicate, many garlands I weave from them, and bind thousands of thoughts within them, and greetings too. You may not have any rich ones, for she is too high and beautiful, all the others must fade, only love remains eternally in our hearts. I seem to be on happier affairs, creating up and down. If my heart shatters, I'll keep digging and singing, and soon dig my own grave. We reached shore, and all the lords stepped out the canoe. Many of the young men had been watching me with sly faces and whispering during my song, I noticed. The gentleman with glasses held my hand as we left and said, I don't even remember what it was anymore, while the older of my ladies gave a look. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Eichendorff. She greeted me very kindly. The beautiful woman had kept her eyes lowered throughout my entire song, and now she left as well, saying nothing. But tears were already in my eyes as I sang. My heart felt like it would burst from the shame and pain of the song. All at once, everything came together for me, how beautiful she is, and how poor I am, ridiculed and abandoned by the world. And when they all disappeared behind the bushes, I could hold back no longer. I threw myself on to the grass and wept bitterly. The second chapter, the road, passed close to the lordly garden, separated only by a high wall. There was a very clean customs house with a red-tiled roof, and behind it a small flower garden, surrounded by a colourful fence that met the shadowed and secluded part of the castle garden through a gap in its wall. That's where the customs official had just died who used to live there. One morning early, while I was still deeply asleep, the castle scribe came to me and urgently called me to Mr. Official. I quickly got dressed and followed the cheerful scribe, who on his way picked flowers here and there, pinning them to his coat, waved his walking stick around dramatically, and spoke into the wind. Things I didn't understand, since my eyes and ears were still heavy with sleep. When I entered the office, still not properly daylight, the official emerged from behind a massive inkwell and piles of paper and books, under an impressive wig like an owl emerging from its nest, and asked, "What's his name? Where does he come from? Can he write, read, and count?" When I confirmed these abilities, he said, "Well, considering his good conduct and special merits, the widowed position has been given to him." I quickly reviewed my previous behavior and manners in my mind, and I had to admit that the official was right. And so I became a customs official before I knew it. I immediately took up residence in my new post and was settled in short order. I found several items left behind by the late official, including a magnificent red sleeping gown with yellow dots, green slippers, a sleep cap, and some pipes with long stems. I had already desired these things when I was at home, as I often saw our pastor wear them so comfortably. The whole day I didn't have anything else to do. I sat on the bench in front of my house in my sleeping gown and sleep cap, smoking tobacco from the longest pipe I found among the official's belongings, and watching people pass by on the country road, driving and riding their horses. All I wished for was for some people from my village, who always said I would amount to nothing in life, to see me now. Here is the translation of the text. While preserving the name Eichendorff, I passed by here and wished to see him, The nightgown fit me well, and overall everything felt quite comfortable. So I sat there, pondering various things. How the beginning is always difficult, how a more refined life is actually quite convenient, and secretly resolving to give up all travelling. Save money like others, and undoubtedly make something significant in the world. Meanwhile, amidst my resolutions, cares, and affairs, I did not forget the most beautiful woman. I threw out the potatoes and other vegetables from my small garden and replaced them entirely with the finest flowers. The castle porter, with his large royal nose, who often visited me since I moved here and became an intimate friend, regarded me suspiciously from the side, thinking I had been driven mad by sudden fortune. But I remained unperturbed. Not far from me, in the lordly garden, I heard fine voices speaking. Among them, I recognized my beautiful wife's voice, though I couldn't see anyone due to the dense bushes. So each day I would gather a bouquet of the most exquisite flowers and climber over the wall every evening when it grew dark. I'd place the bouquet on a stone table in the middle of an arbor, and then every night as I brought the new bouquet, the old one would be gone from the table. One evening, the lordly family went hunting. The sun was setting, bathing the entire land in radiance and shimmering light. The Danube wound its way gracefully, like a river of pure gold and fire, into the vast distance. From all the mountains, the winemakers sang and cheered. I sat on a bench outside my house with the porter, enjoying the mild air as the pleasant day slowly darkened and passed. Suddenly, we heard the horns of returning hunters in the distance, occasionally echoing with responses from the mountains across. I was filled with pure joy to the core and leapt up, exclaiming in a state of enchantment, "No, this is my calling noble hunting." The porter calmly scraped his pipe and said, "That's just what you think. I've tried it. One barely earns enough to wear out their shoes. Coughing and sneezing doesn't go away. It comes from constantly wet feet." A fit of reckless anger seized me, causing my whole body to tremble. All of a sudden, the entire man with his boring coat, perpetually wet feet, his pipe smoking, large nose, and everything else seemed abhorrent to me. I grasped him by the chest beside myself and said, "Porter, you go home now, or I'll beat you here immediately." The porter's old opinion returned. He thought I was... Here is the English translation while preserving the name Eichendorff. He had gone mad. He looked at me with concern and hidden fear, broke away without a word, and walked, still glancing back at me with unease, with long strides towards the castle. There, breathless, he declared that I was indeed completely raving. But in the end, I couldn't help but laugh loudly, and was heartily to be rid of this overly clever companion, for it was just the time when I would usually place the bouquet in the arbor. I quickly leaped over the wall and then approached the stone table as I heard horse hooves in the distance. I could not move. My beautiful, gracious wife had already arrived, riding slowly down the alleyway in a green hunting outfit, feathers nodding on her hat. My feelings were as if I'd read about the beautiful Magellan in my father's old books, appearing between the ever nearby forest horn sounds and flickering evening lights under the tall trees, was frozen in place. She became frightened when she suddenly noticed me and held still almost unconsciously. I felt drunk from fear, heart palpitations and immense joy, and as I realized she was holding my bouquet from yesterday against her chest, I could no longer contain myself and said, quite confused, "Most gracious lady, take this bouquet from me as well as all the flowers from my garden, and everything I have. Oh, if only I could jump into the fire for you. She had initially looked at me so seriously and almost angrily that it pierced through my bones. But then she kept her eyes downcast while I spoke. Just then, several riders and voices were heard in the bushes. She quickly grabbed the bouquet from my hand and disappeared around the corner without saying a word. From that evening on, I knew neither rest nor peace. It was always as if spring had just begun, restless and joyful without me knowing why, as if some great fortune or something extraordinary was about to happen. The fatal calculations plagued me even more whenever sunlight fell through the chestnut tree outside my window onto the numbers, making them dance with transport. I had strange thoughts, so confused that I couldn't count to 3. The number 8 always reminded me of my fat, tightly laced lady with the wide headpiece, while the wicket 7 was like a road sign or gallows that only ever pointed backward. But the most entertaining for me was the 9, which often flipped upside down and became a clever 6 before I knew it, while the 2 looked at me like a question mark, asking, "Where are you headed in the end?" Poor 0. Without her, this slender one and all, you remain forever nothing. Even sitting outside the door no longer suited me. I took a stool out and put my feet on it, flicked an old parasol from its stand, and placed it against the sun like a Chinese pleasure house over myself. But nothing helped. It seemed to me, as I sat and smoked and mused, that my legs were gradually getting longer from boredom, and my nose was growing from idleness as I looked down at her for hours. And when sometimes before dawn an extra post would pass by, and I would step half asleep in the cool air, and a cute face, visible only through the sparkling eyes in the twilight, would peer curiously out from the carriage and offer me a friendly good morning. In all the surrounding villages, cocks were crowing fresh over the gently swaying cornfields, and between the morning streaks high up in the sky, single early awakened larks fluttered, and then the postman blew his horn and continued on. I stood for a long time watching the carriage, and it was as if I had to leave right away, far, far into the world. Meanwhile, I still laid my flower bouquets down on the stone table in the dark arbor as soon as the sun went down. But that was the end of it since that evening. No one cared. Every morning, when I looked early, the flowers were still there, just as they had been yesterday, looking at me with their wilted hanging heads and dewdrops standing up on them, sadly as if they were crying. This displeased me very much. I didn't tie a bouquet any more. In my garden, weeds could grow however they wanted, and I left the flowers to stand and grow until the wind blew away the leaves. It was just as wild and colourful and confused in my heart. During these critical times, it happened that one day, as I lay at home by the window looking vaguely into empty space, the maid from the castle trotting across the street. She quickly approached me when she saw me and stood at the window. "The gentleman returned from his journey yesterday," she said hurriedly. "Really?" I responded, surprised, as I hadn't been concerned with anything for several weeks, and didn't even know that the Lord had been away. Then his daughter, the young lady, will certainly have been very happy. The maid looked at me curiously from head to toe, making me reflect on whether I had said something foolish. "But he knows nothing," she finally said, frowning her little nose. "Well," she continued, "there is to be a dance and masquerade at the castle this evening in honor of the Lord, and my lady will also be masked as a gardener. Do you understand?" Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff. She said, as a gardener, she has noticed that he has particularly beautiful flowers in his garden. I was amazed when I thought to myself, with all the weeds around, you hardly see any flower anymore. She continued, since her grace needs fresh flowers for her attire, straight from the beds, he should bring some and wait for her under the large pear tree in the castle garden this evening. Once it gets dark, she will then come and pick them. I was overjoyed by this news and ran out of the window to the maid's chamber. Pish, that nasty nightgown, she exclaimed as she saw me suddenly emerging from my room wearing it outdoors. I wanted to put on something more elegant, but I couldn't stay behind in terms of style. So I did some graceful pirouettes to catch her attention and kiss her. However, unfortunately, the nightgown got tangled under my feet while I was trying to move around, and I fell lengthwise on the ground. As I regained my composure, the maid had already left, and I could still hear her laughing from far away as she held her sides. Now, I had something to think about and be happy about. She still remembered me and my flowers. I went to my little garden and quickly pulled out all the weeds from the beds, tossing them high above my head into the shimmering air, banishing all troubles and melancholy at the root. The roses now looked like her lips, the sky, blue windflowers like her eyes, and the snow, white lily with its drooping head resembled her. I carefully gathered them all in a basket. It was a beautiful, quiet evening, not a cloud in the sky. A few stars were already visible. Distant whispers of the Danube flowed over the fields, and countless birds sang merrily among the tall trees in the lordly garden next to mine. Oh, how happy I was! As night finally descended, I took my basket by my side and set off towards the large garden. The basket held such a colourful, charming assortment of white, red, blue, and fragrant blooms that my heart laughed when I looked inside. I walked happily, lost in pleasant thoughts, under the beautiful moonlight, through quiet alleys lined with clean sand, over little white bridges where swans slept soundly on the water, past delicate arcades and summer houses. I soon found the large pear tree, as it was the same one where I used to sit on hot afternoons when I was a gardener's apprentice. It was so dark and secluded here. Only a tall linden tree rustled and whispered with its silvery leaves continuously. Music from the castle wafted over occasionally. Sometimes I heard voices in the garden coming close to me at times. Then suddenly everything grew still again. My heart pounded. I felt a chill. Here is the translation. While preserving the name Eichendorff, I felt a strange restlessness, as if I wanted to steal something. I stood motionless for a long time, leaning against a tree, listening in all directions. But since no one ever came, I couldn't take it any more. I hung my basket on my arm and quickly climbed up the pear tree to breathe fresh air again. Up there, I heard the dance music echoing through the treetops. I looked over the entire garden and straight into the brightly lit windows of the castle. There, the chandeliers spun slowly like crowns of stars. Countless polished gentlemen and ladies swayed and danced around chaotically. Sometimes someone would lean out the window and look down into the garden. But outside, in front of the castle, the lawn, bushes, and trees were illuminated by the lights from the ballroom, making them seem golden, as if awakening flowers and birds. Around and behind me, the garden was black and still. I thought to myself up there in the tree, she's dancing now, surely has forgotten you and your flowers for a long time. Everything is so cheerful, no one cares about you. This is how it feels everywhere and always. Everyone has their little spot on earth. They have a warm oven, a cup of coffee, their wife, a glass of wine for dinner, and they are perfectly content. Even the doorman seems happy in his thick skin. I'm not happy anywhere. It feels like arrived too late everywhere, as if the whole world hadn't been expecting me. As I'm musing along, suddenly I hear something rustling through the grass below. Two fine voices spoke quietly and close to each other. Soon the branches parted, and the chambermaid stuck her small face out between the leaves, scanning her surroundings. The moonlight sparkled on her clever eyes as they peered out. I held my breath and looked down intently. It didn't take long for the gardener to emerge between the trees, just as the chambermaid had described to me yesterday. My heart skipped a beat. She was holding a caterpillar and seemed surprised at the spot. For a moment it seemed she wasn't quite slender and cute. Finally she came closer to the tree and took the caterpillar from her. It was indeed the other kind, older lady. How relieved I was when I recovered from my initial shock that I was safe up here. I thought to myself, how come she only showed up now, if this is when the dear, beautiful, kind lady comes to gather the flowers? It's going to be a wonderful story. I almost wanted to cry out of frustration over the whole spectacle. As the disguised gardener started talking below, it's so stuffy and hot up in the ballroom. I had to go cool off a bit outside. Here is the translation of the text. Preserving the name Eichendorff, in the free and beautiful nature, she fanned herself with the lava exhaling air. Under the bright moonlight, I could clearly see how her throat was swollen with ticks. She looked furious, her face brick red. The chambermaid searched frantically behind every hedge as if she had lost a pin. I desperately need fresh flowers for my mask, continued the gardener, wherever they may be. The chambermaid searched on, giggling secretly to herself. Did you say something? Rosette asked the gardener sharply. I said what I always have, replied the chambermaid, making a serious and sincere face. He is and remains a scoundrel. He's probably sleeping behind a bush somewhere. My whole body tingled with the urge to jump down and save my reputation. Suddenly we heard a loud drum roll, music and noise coming from the castle. The gardener didn't wait any longer. The people are bringing greetings to the Lord, she said sadly, will be missed. With that she quickly hid the lava behind her back, and accompanied by the chambermaid, walked angrily towards the castle, and trees and shrubs pointed at her curiously like long-nosed and fingered creatures, while the moonlight danced up and down over her broad waist like across a keyboard. And just as I sometimes see singers on stage, she left quickly under the sound of trumpets and drums. Up in my tree, I didn't really know what had happened to me. So I kept my eyes fixed on the castle. A circle of tall lanterns at the bottom of the entrance stairs cast a strange glow over the sparkling windows and deep into the garden. It was servants who were just performing a serenade for their young mistress. In the middle of them stood the elegantly dressed porter, like a state minister, in front of a music stand, diligently playing on a fagot, just as I prepared to listen to the beautiful serenade. The doors on the castle's balcony suddenly opened upstairs. A tall gentleman, handsome and stately in uniform and adorned with numerous sparkling stars, stepped onto the balcony. By his side was the gracious young woman dressed entirely in white, like a lily in the night or the moon crossing the clear sky. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene, and the garden, trees and fields vanished before my senses as the tall, slender lanterns illuminated everything wonderfully. Soon he engaged in amiable conversation with the beautiful officer on the balcony, and then nodded gently down at the musicians. Below, the people were overjoyed, and I joined them, shouting vivat with all my might. But when she disappeared from the balcony, a short while later, one lantern after another went out below, the music stands were cleared away, and the garden all around grew dark again and rustled as it had before. It was then that I suddenly realized everything I noticed for the first time, that Aunt had sent me with the flowers, that the beautiful one didn't think of me at all and had been married for a long time, and that I myself was a great fool. All this threw me deep into a pit of reflection. I curled up like a hedgehog among the thorns of my own thoughts. From the castle, dance music no longer reached me as often as before. Clouds drifted alone across the dark garden. And so I sat up in the tree above like an owl in the ruins of my happiness all night long. The cool morning air finally woke me from my dreams. I was quite amazed to look around me like this all at once. Music and dancing had been over for a long time. The castle and everything around it on the lawn and the stone steps and columns appeared still, cold and sullen. Only the fountain in front of the entrance continued to splash alone. Birds stirred in the branches beside me, shaking their colorful feathers and looking curiously at their strange sleep companion as they stretched their small wings. Happy morning rays sparkled across the garden toward my chest. Then I sat up in my tree and looked out for the first time in a long time that far into the country, where individual ships were already sailing down the Danube between the vineyards, and the empty road seemed to stretch away like bridges over shimmering land, high into the mountains and valleys. I don't know how it happened, but suddenly my former travel desire gripped me again, all that old melancholy, and joined great anticipation. At the same time, I remembered how the beautiful woman up in the castle was sleeping between flowers and under silk blankets, and an angel sat by her bed in the morning stillness. No, I cried out, I must leave here forever, as far as the sky is blue. And with that, I picked up my basket and threw it high into the air, so that it looked very beautiful as the flowers scattered among the branches and on the green grass below. Then I quickly climbed down myself and walked through the still garden toward my home. Often I stood in one place or another where I had once seen her, thought her resting in the shade. Everything around my little house looked just as it did when I left yesterday. The garden was plundered and barren. Inside the room the large ledger lay open. My violin, which I had almost completely forgotten about, hung dusty on the wall. But a morning ray from the window across the street shot lightning fast over the strings. It produced a true sound in my heart. Yes, I said. Come, you faithful instrument. Our realm is not of this world. And so I took the violin from the wall, leaving behind the account book, nightcap, slippers, pipe, and parasol, and set out from my cottage, as poor as were when I arrived, down the gleaming country road. I glanced back many times. I felt a strange mixture of sadness, and yet such overwhelming joy, like a bird escaping from its cage. As I had already travelled a good distance, I took up my violin outdoors and sang, Leave it to God's care, streams, larks, forest and field, and earth and sky. He keeps them all in order. My affairs are well taken care of. The castle garden and towers of Vienna were already sunk into the morning mist behind me. Above me, countless larks jubilated high in the air. So I passed between green mountains and charming towns and villages down to Italy. Chapter 3, but that was a problem. I had not even considered that I actually didn't know which way to go. There was no one around at that quiet hour of morning with whom I could ask for directions. And not far from me, the country road split into numerous new roads that stretched high over the highest mountains as if leading out of the world, making my head spin when I looked closely. Finally, a farmer came along. He was walking to church, I think, since it was Sunday, in an old-fashioned overcoat with large silver buttons and a long Spanish pipe with a very heavy silver button on top that sparkled in the sun from far away. I immediately asked him politely, "Could you tell me where the road to Italy goes?" The farmer stopped, looked at me, then pursed his lips and looked at me again. I repeated, "To Italy, where the oranges grow." "Ah, what does his orange business have to do with me?" said the farmer, and continued on his way. I would have expected more help from this man, as he looked quite respectable. So what was I to do? Turn back and go back to my village. People would point at me with their fingers, and boys would jump around me asking, "1,000 welcomes from the world. How is it in the world? Did he bring us pepper cookies from the world? The porter with the carefree nose, who knew a lot about world history overall, often told me. Dearest Mr. Tax Collector, Italy is a beautiful country where God takes care of everything. You can lie down in the sun and pluck raisins into your mouth, and if a tarantula bites you, you'll dance with incredible agility, even if you haven't learned to dance before." "Oh, no, to Italy. To Italy," I exclaimed happily and ran down the road that happened to be in front of me without thinking about the different paths. And as I walked for some distance, here is the English translation, while preserving the name Eichendorff, I saw a beautiful garden on the right side of the road where the morning sun playfully shone through the trunks and branches, making it seem as if the grass were covered with golden carpets. Not seeing anyone around, I climbed over the low garden fence and lay comfortably under an apple tree in the grass, since my previous rest in a tree still left my body aching. From there one could see far into the country, and on a Sunday bell sounds from distant churches echoed over the quiet fields, while neatly dressed peasants walked towards church through meadows and bushes. My heart was filled with joy. Birds sang above me in the tree. I thought of my mill and the garden of the kind lady, and how everything seemed so far away, until I eventually fell asleep. Then I dreamt that this beautiful woman from the magnificent region below came to me, or rather flew slowly between the bell sounds, veiled in long white robes that rustled in the morning glow. It felt as if we were not strangers, but in my village by the mill, enjoying the deep shadows. Yet everything was still and empty, just like when people are at church on Sundays, and only the organ's melody reaches us through the trees, which made my heart ache. The beautiful woman was kind and gentle. She held my hand and walked with me while singing that lovely song she always used to sing at sunrise by her open window, accompanied by a guitar. I saw her reflection in the still pond, even more beautiful, with peculiar large eyes that stared at me so intensely that I almost felt scared. Suddenly, the mill started to turn, first in slow individual beats, and then faster and stronger, creating a roaring sound, while the pond grew dark and turbulent. The beautiful woman turned pale, and her veils became longer and longer, fluttering like misty strips high up into the sky. The rushing grew louder, often sounding as if the porter were blowing on his fagot in between. Finally, I woke up with a heavy heartbeat. A wind had indeed risen, gently passing through the apple tree above me, yet it was neither the mill nor the porter, but the same farmer who earlier refused to show me the way to Italy. He had changed into his Sunday best and stood before me in a white camisole. Well, he said as I wiped sleep from my eyes, is he going to pick poppies here so that he tramples on this beautiful grass instead of going to church? You lazy good for nothing. I was only annoyed that the rude man had woken me up. I jumped up angrily and quickly retorted, "What? Does he want to scold me right here?" Before he thought of it, I used to be a gardener and an overseer. If he wants to go to church, here is the English translation. While preserving the name Eichendorff, I had to remove his slick, greasy sleep cap in front of me, and he wore my red sleep gown with yellow dots. Eichendorff continued, but the gnome didn't care at all. He simply raised both arms to the sides and just kept saying, "What does he want?" I noticed that he was actually a short, stocky fellow with crooked legs, prominent blinking eyes, and a red, slightly askew nose. And as he continued to say nothing but he, with each step getting closer to me, an odd, terrifying dread suddenly seized me. I quickly leaped over the fence and ran across fields, not looking back, until my violin felt loose in my pocket. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the garden and valley were no longer visible. I was standing in a beautiful forest. However, I didn't pay much attention because the spectacle only annoyed me further, and the way he kept calling me irritated me. I silently cursed under my breath for a long time. With these thoughts, I continued on quickly, veering off the main road and deep into the mountains. The wooden path I was on disappeared, leaving just a narrow, barely used path before me. There was no one in sight and not a sound to be heard. Otherwise, it was quite pleasant walking through rustling tree tops, with birds singing beautifully. I asked for God's guidance, took out my violin, and played all my favorite pieces. The music filled the solitary forest merrily, but playing didn't last long, as I kept tripping over fatal tree roots. Eventually, hunger set in, and the forest seemed endless. I wandered aimlessly all day until the sun was already leaning at an angle through the treetops. Finally, I emerged into a small meadow valley surrounded by mountains and filled with red and yellow flowers. Countless butterflies fluttered around them in the fading light. It felt so isolated, as if the world were 100 miles away. Only crickets chirped, and a shepherd lay on high grass nearby, playing his melancholy shawm until one's heart ached. I thought to myself, who has it better than this slacker? We have to struggle in foreign lands and always stay alert. There was a clear stream between us that I couldn't cross, so I called out from afar, "Here's the nearest village." He paid no attention, but simply stuck his head out of the grass, pointing his shawm towards another forest, and continued playing. Meanwhile, I kept walking because it was starting to get dark. The birds, which had made such a ruckus earlier as the last sunlight rays disappeared, were silent now. Through the forest a glimmer passed, and suddenly fell silent, almost instilling in me a sense of fear within the eternal solitude of the woods. Eventually I heard distant dogs barking. I hurried my pace, the forest becoming lighter and lighter until soon I saw, between the final trees, a beautiful green clearing where many children played noisily around a large linden tree standing directly in the middle. Beyond this clearing was an inn, before which several farmers sat at a table, playing cards and smoking tobacco. On the other side, young boys and girls sat outside, wrapping their arms in their aprons and chatting in the cool air. Without much hesitation, I took my violin from my pocket and played a lively peasant tune as I emerged from the forest. The girls were surprised. The elders laughed at how far the sound carried into the forest. As I reached the linden tree and leaned against it, continuing to play, a subtle murmuring and whispering began among the young people on either side. The boys finally put away their Sunday pipes, each taking theirs, and before I knew it, the young farmer folk formed a circle around me, dogs barking, aprons flying, and children staring curiously at my face and fingers as I skillfully played. As the first listener passed, I could clearly see how good music invigorates one's limbs. The farmer boys, who had previously been hunched over their pipes on the benches with stiff legs, were now transformed. They hung their colourful handkerchiefs casually down from their buttonholes and capered playfully around the girls in a most charming display. One of them, feeling quite important, fumbled for a long time in his vest pocket to show the others, finally producing a small silver coin that he tried to press into my hand. I was annoyed despite not having any money on me at the time. "Keep your pennies," I told him. "I'm just playing out of joy because I'm once again among people." Soon after, a beautiful girl approached with a large jug of wine. "Musicians like their drink," she said, laughing kindly, and her pearl white teeth sparkled charmingly between her red lips. She dipped her little nose into the wine while her eyes glinted over the glass at me, then handed me the jug. I drank the entire contents and played once more with fresh enthusiasm, causing everything around me to spin merrily. The elders had left their game, and the younger folks were growing tired, dispersing, so the inn gradually fell silent and empty. Even the girl who served me the wine went towards the village now, but she walked very slowly and looked around from time to time as if she had forgotten something. Finally, she stopped and searched for something on the ground, but I could see that when she bent down, she was glancing back at me under her arm. I had learned about life at the castle, so I quickly approached and asked, "Have you lost anything, dearest maiden?" "Oh, no," she replied, blushing deeply. "It was just a rose. Would he like to have it?" I thanked her and put the rose in my buttonhole. She looked at me very kindly and said, "He plays beautifully." Yes, I agreed. It's a gift from God. Musicians are quite rare around here. She continued, lowering her eyes constantly. He could make a good living playing. Jeremy father also plays the violin and enjoys listening to foreigners talk, and my father is very rich. She then burst into laughter and said, "If only he wouldn't always make those grimacing faces with his head when playing." "Dearest maiden," I responded, "firstly, please don't call me he all the time. Secondly, regarding these head movements, it's not unique. We virtuosos all have this quirk." "Oh, so?" the girl replied. She wanted to say more, but suddenly there was a terrifying clamour. From the inn, the front door burst open with a loud crash, and a thin man flew out like an ejected cannonball, after which the door immediately slammed shut behind him. The girl sprang back like a deer upon hearing the first noise and disappeared into the darkness. But the figure at the door quickly rose to its feet and began shouting at the house with such speed and vehemence that it was astounding. "What? Am I drunk? Don't I pay for these chalk marks on the smoked-up door? Erase them! Erase them! Didn't I just shave you over the cooking spoon yesterday and cut into your nose?" Shaving leaves a marked cooking spoon, another marked plaster on the nose, yet another mark. How many of these dog-like marks do you want to be paid for? But all right, that's enough. I'll let the whole village, the whole world go unshaven. Grow your beards for me, so that dear God on Judgment Day doesn't know if you're Jews or Christians. Yes! Hang on to your own beards, you hairy land creatures. At this point, he suddenly broke into pitiful sobs and continued sniffling. Should I drink water like a miserable fish? Is that kindness? Am I not human and an experienced butcher? Oh, I'm so angry today. My heart is filled with emotion and love for humanity. As she spoke, she slowly retreated as the house remained silent. When he caught sight of me, he rushed towards me with his arms spread wide. I thought the tall man wanted to embrace me. But I leaped to one side, and he stumbled on, and I heard him for a long time, sometimes roughly, sometimes gently, talking to himself in the darkness. Many thoughts raced through my mind. The maiden who had just given me the rose was young, beautiful, and wealthy could see my chance to seize happiness before anyone could turn their hand. And there were lambs and pigs, a partridge, and fat geese stuffed, with apples no other choice but to imagine the dawn approaching. Seize it, take it. No one laments the freedom of youth. Whoever is lucky enough to find a bride should stay in the land and make a good life for himself. In these philosophical musings, I sat down on a stone in a now deserted square because I dared not knock at the inn, lacking funds. The moon shone brilliantly. Mountains echoed forest sounds into the still night. Occasionally dogs would bark from the village, nestled among trees and bathed in moonlight. I contemplated the heavens as individual clouds slowly passed through the moonlight, and sometimes a star would fall from afar. Thus, I thought, the moon also shines over my father's mill and the white, noble castle. Everything there has been silent for a long time now. The gracious lady sleeps, and the water features and trees in the garden still rustle as they did then. Everyone is indifferent to whether I am here or away or dead. Suddenly the world seemed overwhelmingly vast and empty, and I was all alone within it. My heart ached for tears. As I sat there, I suddenly heard a hoofbeat echo through the forest from afar. I held my breath and listened. It grew closer and closer until I could hear the horses snorting. Soon after, 2 riders emerged from among the trees, pausing at the edge of the forest and speaking in hushed tones, as I could tell by their shadows cast across the moonlit square, pointing to this and that with long, dark arms. Many times when my deceased mother would tell me stories of wild forests and warlike robbers back home, I had always secretly wished to experience such a tale for myself. Now I had my wish. I stretched out along the lime tree under which I was sitting as far as I could reach until I reached the first branch, quickly swinging myself up. But even with half my body hanging from the branch, I wanted to reach for my legs when one of the riders suddenly rushed past me across the square behind me. I closed my eyes tightly in the dark boughs and remained motionless. Who is that? Here is the translated text, preserving the name Eichendorff. Suddenly, right behind me, a voice exclaimed, No one. I cried out in terror, fearing he had finally caught up with me. Deep down, I couldn't help but laugh at the sight of the men and turning my empty pockets inside out. "Well, well," said the robber again, "but whose 2 legs are hanging down there?" There was no use denying it any more. "Just some poor, lost musician's legs," I replied, quickly dropping back to the ground as I felt embarrassed at remaining suspended like a broken fork. The rider's horse shied when I suddenly came crashing down from the tree. He patted its neck and laughed, saying, "Well, we're also lost, so we make quite the pair. I thought you might help us find our way to B. It shouldn't be a problem for you. I had insisted that I didn't know where B was, preferring to ask at the inn or guide them down into the village. The man wouldn't listen to reason." He calmly drew a pistol from his belt, which gleamed beautifully in the moonlight. "My dear fellow," he said in a friendly manner while wiping the barrel and occasionally holding it up to his eye, "my dear fellow, you'll have to go ahead to be yourself." I was now in a spot of trouble. If I found the right path, I'd surely encounter the bandit gang and get beaten, since I had no money on me. If I didn't, I would also get beaten. So, without much deliberation, I took the first suitable path that led away from the inn towards the village. The rider quickly returned to his companion, and both of them followed me at a slow pace, some distance behind. We were essentially stumbling our way into the bright moonlit night. The path continuously snaked along a mountain slope within the forest. At times we could glimpse deep, quiet valleys far below as the treetops reached from below and stirred in the darkness. A nightingale sang back and forth. Dogs barked in the distance from the villages. A river constantly rushed from below, occasionally glistening in the moonlight. Along with the steady clatter of horses' hooves, the chatter of the riders behind me in an unfamiliar language, the bright moonlight, and the long shadows cast, the tree trunks that alternated between, making them a black, white, tiny, or enormous, my thoughts became thoroughly jumbled, as if I were dreaming and couldn't wake up. I kept walking steadily forward. Translation: with the morning greeting, all fear had dissipated. But the 2 riders stretched and looked around cautiously, suddenly realizing that we might not be on the right path after all. They resumed their chatter, and I noticed they were speaking of me. It seemed to me that one of them began to fear me, as if I could be such a stealthy pheasant leading them astray in the forest. This amused me, for as the light spread around, my courage grew, especially since we had just emerged onto a beautiful open woodland clearing. I looked around wildly, and then whistled a few times on my fingers, like mischievous children signaling to each other. "Help!" one of the riders suddenly exclaimed, causing me to jump. I looked around and saw both of them dismounting and tying their horses to a tree. But one of them quickly approached me, staring at me intensely before bursting into an unreasonable fit of laughter. I must admit his nonsensical laughter annoyed me. "Truly, this is the gardener," he said. "The steward of the castle." I gave him a wide look, but couldn't remember him. I would have had my hands full if I wanted to take in all the young gentlemen who occasionally rode through the castle. He continued with endless laughter. "Splendid. You're dressed like me. We clearly need a servant. Stay with us. You'll have perpetual vacancies." I was completely bewildered and finally said that I was on a journey to Italy. "Italy?" The stranger replied, "We're heading there too." "Well, if so," I exclaimed, taking my violin out of my pocket and playing until the forest birds awaken. The gentleman quickly caught up with the other, and they rolled around together on the grass like crazy. Suddenly, they stood still. "By God," one of them cried, "I see the church tower of B. Well, we should be there soon." He took out his watch and had it repeated, shook his head, and had it chime again. "No," he said, "that won't do. We'll arrive too early. That could spell trouble." So they brought out cakes, roasted meats, and wine bottles from their horses, spread a beautiful, colourful blanket on the green grass sprawled across it, and indulged in a most enjoyable feast, sharing with me very generously from all of it, which did me good as I hadn't eaten properly in several days. "And you know this," one of them said to me. "But you don't know us." I shook my head. "Well, then let me tell you, I'm the painter Leonhard, and that over there is another painter Guido. I now studied the two painters more closely at dawn." Here is the English translation, preserving the name Eichendorff. One of them, Mr. Leonhard, was tall and slender, with a brown complexion, lively, fairy eyes. The other was much younger, smaller, and more delicate, dressed in old German style, as the porter put it, with a white collar and bare neck, around which hung his dark brown curls that he often had to shake away from his pretty face. After he'd finished breakfasting, he picked up my violin, which I'd placed beside me on the floor, sat down on a felled tree branch, and plucked the strings with his fingers. Then he sang along with a bright voice like a forest bird. When the first morning ray glides through the still misty valley, forest and hills awaken, and whoever can fly takes wings and throws his hat into the air with joy. Man cries out, if song has also wings. Now I'll sing happily. The rosy morning light played gently over his slightly pale face and black, loving eyes. I was so tired, however, the words and notes grew increasingly jumbled as he sang, until I eventually fell fast asleep. Gradually waking up, I heard, as if in a dream, the two painters still talking beside me, birds singing overhead, and morning rays shining through my closed eyelids, an inner darkness turning to light like when the sun shines through red silk curtains. "How beautiful!" I heard someone exclaim right next to me. I opened my eyes and saw the young painter standing over me in the sparkling morning light, bending nearly double so that only his large black eyes could be seen among the hanging curls. I quickly sat up, since it had already become broad daylight. Mr. Leonhard seemed displeased, with 2 furrows of anger on his brow, and he hurriedly prepared to leave. The other painter, however, brushed his curls away from his face and hummed a tune while combing his horse's mane, singing calmly, until Leonhard suddenly burst out laughing, quickly grabbed a bottle still standing on the grass, and poured its contents into their glasses. To a happy arrival, he declared, clinking glasses together, creating a beautiful sound. He then threw the empty bottle high into the morning glow, where it sparkled playfully in the air. Finally, they mounted their horses, and I continued walking beside them. Before us lay an immense valley that we now descended. There was lightning rustling, shimmering, and jubilation. A cool, joyful feeling washed over me, as if I were meant to fly from the mountain into this splendid region. 4th chapter, farewell, mill and castle. Porter. Now the wind whistled through my hat. Villages, towns, and vineyards flew by on both sides, blurring before our eyes. Behind us, the 2 painters in the carriage. Before me, 4 horses with a magnificent postilion, I high up on the coachman's seat, often flying as high as a tower. This was how it came to pass when, Before we arrived in the village, a long, gaunt, grim man dressed in a green fur-lined coat approached us, making many obeisances to the artists and guiding us into the village. There stood under the tall linden trees in front of the post office a magnificent carriage with 4 postal horses. Mr. Leonhard remarked during our journey that my clothes were too big for me. He quickly produced other garments from his coat pocket, and I had to wear an entirely new, beautiful suit and vest that looked very elegant on me, except that everything was too long and wide, flapping around me. I also received a brand new hat that glistened in the sun as if it were smeared with fresh butter. Then the grim stranger took hold of the 2 horses belonging to the artists while they dismounted, jumped into the carriage, and I climbed onto the pommel horse. We set off at once, just as the postmaster peered out of his window wearing a sleep cap. The postillion sounded his horn merrily, and we headed towards Italy with fresh vigor. I had planned to lead a splendid life up there, like a bird in flight, without having to fly myself. I had nothing to do but sit on the pommel horse day and night and occasionally deliver food and drink from the innkeeper's houses to the carriage, as the artists didn't speak to anyone. And during the daytime they would pull the windows of the carriage shut so tightly that it seemed as if the sun were trying to set them alight. From time to time, Herr Godot would stick his head out of the carriage window and engage in friendly conversation with me, laughing at Mr. Leonhard, who did not appreciate this. I often found myself on the brink of displeasing my master, once while playing the violin on the pommel horse during a beautiful, starry night, and later due to sleep. This last incident was quite astonishing. I wanted to take in the sights of Italy properly, so I kept my eyes wide open every quarter hour. But as soon as I did, the 16 horse hooves in front of me would swirl and tangle like a net, crossing over one another, causing me to strain my eyes until eventually I fell into an unyielding sleep that left no room for rescue. Whether it was day or night, rain or sunshine, Tyrol or Italy, I would soon lean to the right or then to the left, fall backward over the pommel horse. At times I would press my head with such vehemence towards the ground that my hat flew off, and Herr Guido in the carriage let out a loud cry. This is how I journeyed through half of Italy, as they call it there, Lombardia, until one beautiful evening we stopped at an inn in a rural setting. The post horses had not been ordered for another few hours in the nearby village, so the artists alighted and were led to a special room. To rest here is the English translation of the text, preserving the Eichendorff a little rest and some letters to write. But I was quite pleased about it, and immediately made my way to the guest room, eager to finally enjoy a peaceful and comfortable meal and drink again. The place looked rather disheveled. The maids wandered around with untidy hair, and the open-collared shirts were haphazardly hung on the yellow fur pelts. Around a round table sat the house servants in blue overalls during dinner, occasionally glancing at me from the side. They all had short, thick pigtails and looked quite posh, like the young ladies. Here I am, I thought to myself, and continued eating eagerly, finally finding myself in this land where our Lord Pastor's curious people came from, bringing with them mouse-traps, barometers, and pictures. What knowledge a person gains when they take a step behind the fireplace. As I was just finishing my meal and pondering, a little man who had been sitting in a dark corner of the room drinking wine suddenly emerged like a spider towards me. He was quite short and hunchbacked, but he had a large, dreadful head with a long Roman eagle nose and sparse red sideburns. The powdered hair stood on end from all sides as if a storm wind had gone through. He wore an old-fashioned, worn-out frock coat, short plush trousers, and completely faded silk stockings. He had once been to Germany and was amazed at how well he understood German. He sat down next to me and asked numerous questions while continuously snuffing tobacco. Was I the servant? When would we arrive? Were we going to Rome? But I didn't even know the answers myself, and his gibberish was completely incomprehensible. Do you speak French? I finally asked him in my panic. He shook his large head, which I found very comforting, since I couldn't speak French either. But it didn't help. He had me right where he wanted me, asking over and over. The more we talked, the less each of us understood the other, until eventually both of us became heated, making me feel at times as if the Signer with his eagle nose was going to peck at me. Finally, the maids who had been listening to our Babylonian discourse burst into laughter at both of us. I quickly put down my knife and fork and stepped outside the front door. For in this foreign land it felt as if I were 1,000 fathoms deep in the sea, with my German tongue and all sorts of unfamiliar creatures twisted and fluttered around me in solitude, watching and snapping at me. Outside it was a warm summer night, perfect for wandering. Far away from the vineyards you could still hear a winemaker singing occasionally. Sometimes flashes of light would flicker in the distance, and the entire area quivered and rustled under the moonlight. Yes, sometimes I thought I saw a long, dark figure pass behind the hazelnut bushes in front of the house and peek through the branches. Then it was gone. Everything fell silent all at once. Then Guido just stepped out onto the inn's balcony. He didn't notice me, and he played very skillfully on a zither that he must have found in the house, singing along like a nightingale. One pleasure's loud voice is stilled, and the earth whispers wonders in dreams to hearts barely aware of old times. Gentle sorrow and soft showers of weather light through the chest. I don't know if he sang any more, for I had laid down on the bench in front of the door and fell fast asleep in the warm night due to great exhaustion. A few hours passed, perhaps, before a post horn woke me up, blowing merrily into my dreams for a long time before I could fully regain my senses. Finally, I sprang up as dawn was already breaking over the mountains, and the morning chill ran through every limb of mine. Only then did I remember that we should have been far away by now. I thought, today it's my turn to be woken up and laughed at. How Mr. Guido would come out with his sleepy, curly head if he heard me outside. So I walked through the small garden right under the windows where my lords lived, and stretching myself into the morning glow one last time, and singing joyfully. One the thrush cries out, the day is not far off, when the sun breaks through still tastes so good. The window was open, but everything remained silent above, save for the night wind blowing through the grapevines that reached into the window. Now what does this mean again? I exclaimed in surprise and ran into the house through the quiet corridors towards the room. But there I received a sharp blow to my heart. As I opened the door, it was empty inside. No coat, no hat, no boots, only the zither the Tagodoed Mister had played on yesterday hung on the wall, and on the table in the middle of the room lay a beautiful full money bag with a note attached. I held it closer to the window, and my eyes hardly believed what they saw. It read in large letters for the innkeeper, but all this did me no good if I couldn't find my dear, funny lords again. I slipped the bag into the deep pocket of my coat, which plunged as if into a deep well, hitting me hard in the back. Then I ran out, making much noise, and waking up every servant and maid in the house. They had no idea what I wanted, thinking I had gone crazy. But when they saw the empty room upstairs, they weren't surprised at all. No one knew anything about my lords. Only one maid, from her gestures and expressions, as I pieced them together, noticed that Monsieur Godot, while sitting on the balcony last night, suddenly let out a loud cry before quickly rushing back to the other lord's room. Once, in the middle of the night, she woke up and heard clattering horse hoofs outside. She peered through the small chamber window and saw the hunchback mister who had spoken so much with me yesterday, riding a palomino across the field in the moonlight, soaring high over the saddle as if he were a ghost riding a three-legged horse. I didn't know what to do then. Meanwhile, our carriage had been standing patiently at the door for a long time, and the postilion was impatiently blowing his horn as if it would burst, because he needed to arrive on schedule at the next station, with everything scheduled down to the minute through telegrams. I ran around the entire house again and called out to the painters, but no one answered. The people in the house gathered and together at me, stared at me. The postilion cursed, the horses snorted, and finally, utterly bewildered, I quickly leapt into the carriage. The stable boy shut the door behind me, the postilion slammed it, and off we went into the vast world. Chapter 5, we drove over mountains and valleys day and night without pause. I didn't have time to think, because wherever we arrived, the horses were harnessed. I couldn't talk to people, so my demonstrations were useless, often right in the middle of enjoying a delicious meal at an inn. The postilion would blow his horn. I'd have to drop my fork and knife and jump back into the carriage, not really knowing where or why I was racing off with such exceptional speed. Otherwise, life wasn't so bad. I'd sprawl in one corner or another of the carriage like on a couch, getting to know people and places, and when we passed through towns, I'd lean both arms out the window and thank the people who politely took off their hats before me, or I'd greet the girls at the windows as if they were old friends, always causing them great surprise and curiosity that lasted long after. But then I became very frightened. I had never counted the money in the bag I found. I had to pay a lot of money to postmasters and innkeepers, and before I knew it, the bag was empty. At first, I intended to jump out of the carriage quickly as we passed through a lonely forest and run away. But then I felt sorry for leaving the beautiful carriage alone. I would have happily continued driving it to the ends of the earth. Now, sitting deep in thought, not knowing what to do or where to go, all of a sudden the road veered off to the side. I shouted out the window at the postilion, "Where are you taking us?" But no matter what I said, he always just replied, "Sigh, signor," and drove over rocks and stumps, sending me flying from one corner of the carriage to another. That was not something I wanted to think about, because the road ran straight through. Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name Eichendorff. We beheld a magnificent landscape as the sun dipped below the horizon like a sea of gleam and sparks. But from the side we had turned towards a barren mountain range stretched before us with grey chasms through which darkness had long descended. The further we travelled, the wilder and lonelier became the surroundings. Finally, The moon emerged from behind the clouds and suddenly shone so brightly between the trees and rocks that it was quite frightening to look at. We could only drive slowly through the narrow, rocky chasms, and the monotonous eternal rattling of the carriage coat off the stone walls into the quiet night, as if we were entering a vast home. Only from many waterfalls, which we couldn't see, came an uninterrupted rustling deeper in the forest, and the owls called out from afar, "Come with me, come with me." As I looked, it seemed to me that the driver, who had no uniform, and was not a postilion as I now noticed, glanced around restlessly and started driving faster. When I leaned out towards the carriage, a rider suddenly emerged from the bushes, galloped straight in front of our horses across the road, and then disappeared immediately on the other side into the forest. I was completely confused, for as much as I could make out in the bright moonlight, it was the same hunched little man on his grey steed who had glared at me with an eagle-like nose at the inn. The driver shook his head and laughed loudly at the foolish riding, then quickly turned to me, spoke very fast and excitedly, but unfortunately I didn't understand a word, and continued driving even faster. But soon after I saw a light in the distance. More lights appeared gradually, growing larger and brighter, and finally we passed several smoky cottages that seemed like swallows' nests perched on the rocks. Since the night was warm, the doors were open, and I could see the brightly lit rooms and all sorts of shabby characters sitting around the fire, like dark shadows. We rattled through the quiet night, up a stone path winding towards a high mountain. Sometimes tall trees and hanging bushes hid the entire hollow way, while at other times we could suddenly see the entire heavens, and in the depths the vast silent circle of mountains, forests, and valleys. Atop the mountain stood a large ancient castle with many towers bathed in the brightest moonlight. "Now God be with us," I exclaimed, feeling quite invigorated internally by the anticipation of where they would take me next. It took perhaps another half-hour before we finally arrived at the castle gates on top of the mountain. The path led into a broad round tower that was already partially ruined at the top, and the driver knocked 3 times, and the sound resonated deeply within the ancient castle. Suddenly, a swarm of doves flew out from every loophole and crack, startled, and with great flapping of wings filled the air. Here is the translation of the text. While preserving the name Eichendorff, the carriage crossed and then rolled into the long, dark gateway. The horses' hooves sparked against the stone pavement, a large dog barked, and the carriage rumbled between the arched walls. The doves still cooed among them, so we arrived at an alarming spectacle in the narrow, paved courtyard of the castle. A curious scene, I thought to myself as the carriage came to a halt. Then the door opened from the outside, and an old, tall man with a small lantern looked me sternly beneath his thick eyebrows. He grasped my arm and helped me out of the carriage like a gentleman. Outside the front door, an elderly, very unattractive woman in a black camisole and skirt, with a white apron and a black bonnet, from which a long strand hung down to her nose, stood waiting. She had a large bundle of keys at her hip and held an old-fashioned candelabra with 2 burning wax candles in the other hand. As soon as she saw me, she began bobbing deeply and spoke and asked many confusing things. I didn't understand a word, and I continued to stamp my foot impatiently before her, feeling quite uneasy. Meanwhile, the old man had lit up the carriage with his lantern from all sides and was humming and shaking his head as he looked for any luggage. The coachman then drove the carriage into an old barn that was already open on one side of the courtyard, without asking for a tip from me. The elderly woman politely motioned for me to follow her, using various gestures. She led me through a long, narrow corridor and then up a small stone staircase. As we passed the kitchen, several young maids curiously peeked their heads through half-open doors, staring at me intently, gesturing and nodding secretly to each other, as if they had never seen a man before. Finally, the old woman opened a door upstairs, leaving me momentarily utterly astonished. It was a large, beautiful, stately room with gold decorations on the ceiling and exquisite wallpaper with various figures and large flowers adorning the walls. In the center stood a covered table with roast meat, cake, salad, fruit, wine, and sweets, causing my heart to laugh with joy within me. Between the two windows hung an enormous mirror that reached from the floor to the ceiling. I must say it pleased me greatly. I stretched several times and walked around the room with long, dignified steps. However, I could not resist looking at myself in such a large mirror. Indeed, the new clothes from Lord Leonhard suited me very well. I had also gained a certain fiery look in Italy, but apart from that, I was still just the milky, bearded man I had home. Only a few downy hairs were now visible on my upper lip. The old woman continued to chatter incessantly with her toothless mouth, making it seem as though she hadn't stopped for breath. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff when she chewed on the long, hanging tip of her nose. She then forced me to sit down, stroked my chin with her slender fingers, and called me poor little thing, while her mischievous gaze from red eyes caused one corner of her mouth to lift halfway up to her cheek, and finally left with a deep bow towards the door. I sat myself down at the covered table as a young, pretty maid entered to serve me. I started up all sorts of gallant conversations with her, but she didn't understand a word, merely giving me curious side glances because I was enjoying my meal so much. The food was exquisite. Once I was full and got back up, the maid took a light from the table and led me into another room. There was a sofa, a small mirror, and a magnificent bed with green silk curtains. I signaled to her if I could lie down there. She nodded yes, but it wasn't possible as she stood frozen in place beside me. Finally, I brought in a large glass of wine from the dining room and called out, "Buona notte," as much Italian as I had learned. But as soon as I poured the wine, she suddenly burst into a soft laugh, turned bright red, went back to the dining room, and shut the door behind her. What's there to laugh about? I thought, quite puzzled, believing that people in Italy are all crazy. My only fear was of the postilion starting to blow his horn again. I listened at the window, but it was quiet outside. Let him blow. I thought, undressed, and lay down in the magnificent bed. It felt no different than swimming in milk and honey. The old lime tree in the courtyard rustled its leaves outside. Sometimes a dove would suddenly fly off the roof. Eventually, I fell asleep filled with pleasure. 6th chapter, when I awoke, the first rays of morning light were already playing on the green curtains above me. I couldn't remember where I was. It seemed like I was still riding in the carriage and had dreamed of a castle bathed in moonlight, an old witch, and her pale daughter. I quickly jumped out of bed, dressed, and looked around the room. That's when I noticed a small door covered with wallpaper that I hadn't seen yesterday. It was only slightly ajar, and as I opened it, I saw a tiny, cozy little room that seemed secretive in the morning light. A chair had women's clothes haphazardly thrown over it, and on a bed nearby lay the girl who had served me at the table last night. She slept peacefully with her head resting on her bare white arm, her black curls falling down. If she only knew the door was open, I said to myself before returning to my bedroom. While I closed and locked the door behind me, I did so to prevent the girl from being startled and embarrassed if she woke up. Outside, not a sound was to be heard. Only an early rising forest bird sat on a bush that grew out of the wall in front of my window, singing its morning song. "No," I said, "you shall not embarrass me or praise God so early and diligently all alone." I quickly grabbed my violin, which I had left on the table the day before, and went outside. The castle was still completely silent, and it took a long time to find my way out of the dark corridors into the open air. As I stepped outside, I found myself in a vast garden that descended in broad terraces, one deeper than the other, all the way down to the halfway point of the mountain. But this was a neglected garden. The paths were overgrown with tall grass. The artificial figures carved from boxwood were untrimmed and stuck out like ghosts, their long noses or pointed hats reaching high into the air so that you might fear them in the dimness. Some broken statues stood over a dried-up water feature. Clothes were even hanging on them. Here and there they had built bonfires in the middle of the garden, followed by some ordinary flowers. It was all messy and overgrown with tall wild weeds, through which colourful lizards slithered. However, between the old high trees there was a wide deserted view everywhere, one mountain peak after another, as far as the eye could see. After wandering around in the morning mist for a while, I spotted on the terrace below me a long, thin, pale young man wearing a long brown cloak, with his arms crossed and taking large steps up and down. He'd pretended not to notice me, then sat down on a stone bench, took out a book, read loudly as if he were preaching, occasionally glancing at the sky, before resting his head melancholically on his right hand. I watched him for a long time until my curiosity got the better of me, and I quickly approached him. He let out a deep sigh and jumped up, startled when I arrived. He was mortified, as was I. We both didn't know what to say, so we kept making complimentary remarks to each other until he finally took off with long strides into the bushes. Meanwhile, the sun had risen over the forest, and I climbed onto the bench, strumming my violin in joy, the sound echoing far down into the silent valleys. The old woman with the key bundle, who had already come looking for me throughout the castle to invite me to breakfast, now appeared on the terrace above me and was surprised I could play so beautifully on the violin. The old grim man from the castle also joined in, amazed as well. Eventually the maids arrived, and everyone up top stood there astonished. I kept playing more intricately and rapidly with my bow, performing cadences and variations until I finally grew weary. This is the English translation of the text. Preserving the name Eichendorff, it was indeed quite strange on the castle. No one thought about continuing their journey. The castle was not a tavern, but belonged, as I found out from the maid, to a rich count. Sometimes, when I inquired about the count's name and where he lived, she would always smile, just like on the first evening I arrived at the castle, and twinkle her eyes playfully, as if she weren't quite right in the head. If I drank an entire bottle of wine on a hot day, the maids would surely laugh when they brought the next one. And when I once asked for a pipe of tobacco, signaling what I wanted, They all burst into a great, unreasonable fit of laughter. The most surprising thing to me was a night music that often played, especially in the darkest nights, just below my window. It would play only occasional, very soft chords on a guitar. Once, however, it seemed to me as if it were calling from below, P.S. I quickly jumped out of bed and put my head out the window. Hey, who's there? I called down. But no one answered. I only heard something run quickly through the bushes. The large dog in the courtyard barked a few times at my noise. Then suddenly everything grew quiet again, and the night music was never heard from again. Otherwise, I had a life here as desired by any human being in the world. The kind porter! He knew what he was saying when he always used to say that in Italy raisins would grow into your mouth on their own. I lived in this lonely castle like a bewitched prince. Wherever I stepped, people showed me great deference, even though they all already knew I had not a single coin in my pocket. I could only say, set the table, and fine meals would appear: rice, wine, melons, and Parmesan cheese. I indulged myself, slept in the magnificent bed, strolled through the garden, played music, and sometimes helped out in the greenhouse as well. Often I would lie for hours in the high grass in the garden, while the young man, a student and relative of the old woman who was staying here during the vacation, would walk around me in wide circles with his long cloak, murmuring like a magician from his book, which would put me to sleep every time. Day after day passed until I began to get melancholic about the good food and drink. My limbs ached from the lack of activity, and it felt as if I was falling apart from idleness. During this time I once sat on a sweltering afternoon at the top of a tall tree that stood on a slope, swaying slowly back and forth over the still, deep valley. The bees buzzed between the leaves. Around me, otherwise all was extinct. No human was to be seen between the mountains. Deep below me on the quiet meadowland, cows rested on the tall grass. But from far away came the sound of a post-thorn carrying over the wooded peaks, soon barely audible, then again clear and bright. Suddenly an old song came to my heart that I had learned at home in my father's mill from a wandering craftsman, so I sang. Who wishes to wander abroad must go with his dearest love. Let others stand alone while the stranger is left behind. What do you know, dark peaks of the ancient beautiful time? Ah, the homeland beyond the hills, how far it lies from here. Most of all, I admire the stars. They seemed to greet me as I went by. The nightingale I hear, so gladly it sang before her door. Morning is my joy, then I climb at dawn to the highest mountain in the distance. Greetings, Germany, from the bottom of my heart. It was as if the post-thorn accompanied my song from afar. It drew closer and closer between the mountains while I sang, until finally I heard it ringing on top of the castle yard. I quickly jumped down from the tree. There, the old woman approached me with an open package from the castle. There's something for you too, she said, handing me a small, charming little note from the package. It had no address, so I quickly opened it. Suddenly, my whole face turned red as a peony, and my heart beat so heavily that the old woman noticed it, for the note was from a beautiful wife of whom I'd seen several little notes with Mr. Official. She wrote briefly, all is well again. All obstacles have been removed. I took this secret opportunity to be the first to write you this joyful message. Come back, hurry. It's so lonely here, and I can barely live since you left. Aurelia, my eyes filled with tears of joy and terror and countless happiness. I felt ashamed before the old woman, who smiled at me repulsively again and flew like an arrow to the most solitary corner of the garden. There I lay down under the hazelnut bushes and read the note again, repeating the words in my mind, reading them over and over, while sunbeams danced between the leaves, forming golden, bright green, and red flowers before my eyes. Did she perhaps never get married? I thought, was the foreign officer then her brother? Or is he now dead? Or am I mad? It doesn't matter. I finally exclaimed, jumping up. No, it's clear. She loves me. Yes, she loves me. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow across the sky, the birds sang merrily throughout the forests, and the valleys shimmered with light. Yet in my heart there was 1,000 times more beauty and joy. I called out to the castle, requesting that they bring my dinner outside to the garden that day. The old woman, the grim old man, the maids all had to join me under the tree at the set table. I took out my violin and played while I ate and drank. Everyone's mood lightened. The old man smoothed his wrinkles, raising glass after glass. The old woman chattered. Non-stop the maids started dancing on the lawn. Even the pale student, curious but disdainful, peeked out, glanced at the spectacle, then attempted to leave with an air of sophistication. But I, not one to be idle, quickly sprang up, grabbed him by his long coat, and rolled around with him playfully. He tried to dance gracefully, moving stiffly and artificially as sweat dripped from his face, and the long skirts swirled around us like a wheel. In between, he would glance at me with curious, squinted eyes, making me feel a sudden surge of fear. The old woman, eager to know what was in the letter and why I'd suddenly become so cheerful, but it was too complicated to explain. I simply pointed to some cranes soaring high above us and said that I had to leave forever. She widened her parched eyes in surprise, looking between me and the old man as if she were a basilisk. Then I noticed them exchanging glances secretly whenever I turned away, speaking intently while occasionally glancing at me from the side, at my attention. I pondered what they might be planning for me. Deep in thought, the sun had long set, so I wished everyone good night and climbed into my sleeping chamber with a pensive mood. Internally, I was joyful yet restless, pacing back and forth for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed heavy, black clouds across the castle tower, barely allowing one to make out the nearby mountain peaks in the thick darkness. Suddenly, I heard voices down in the garden. I extinguished my light and went to the window. The voices grew closer, but they spoke quietly among themselves. Then a tiny lantern carried by someone under a cloak cast a long beam. Recognizing the grim castle manager and the old housekeeper, the light flashed across the old woman's face, which had never seemed so terrifying to me before. Wore there a long knife in her hand. I could see that both of them had looked up towards my window just now. Then the caretaker buttoned his coat tighter, and it was soon dark and silent again. What do they want out in the garden at this hour? I shuddered as all the murder stories I'd ever heard came rushing back to Meof witches and bandits slaughtering people for their hearts. As I pondered further, human footsteps echoed up the stairs, then along the long corridor, slowly, quietly towards my door. It felt like whispers were exchanged between secret voices. I quickly darted to the other end of the room behind a large table, ready to lift it and charge at the door as soon as anything moved. But in the darkness, I knocked over a chair with such force that it made an awful clattering noise. Suddenly, all became quiet outside. I listened behind the table, eyes fixed on the door, willing them through my gaze until my eyes felt like they were popping out of my head. After a while of behaving so calmly that I could have heard flies walking on the wall, I heard someone slowly insert a key into the lock from outside. I was about to sprint with my table when the key turned 3 times slowly in the door, then pulled out carefully and purred softly down the corridor and stairs. I took a deep breath. I thought they've locked me up so they'll be comfortable when I finally fall asleep soundly. I quickly checked the door. It was indeed locked, as was the other door behind, which slept the beautiful pale maid. This had never happened before during my time at the castle. There I sat, trapped in a strange land. The lovely lady stood by her window, gazing across the still garden to the country road, wondering if I'd already passed by playing my violin at the toll booth, as clouds raced quickly across the sky and time slipped away and I couldn't leave. Oh, my heart ached so much that I didn't know what to do. And every time a leaf rustled outside or a rat scurried on the floor, it felt like an old woman had sneaked in through a hidden door behind the wallpaper and was creeping silently around the room with her long knife. As I sat worriedly on the bed, suddenly, for the first time in a long while, I heard the night music below my windows. With the first note of the guitar, it felt as though a ray of dawn had suddenly shone through my soul. I opened the window and called out quietly that I was awake. "Shh," came the reply from below. Without pausing long, I tucked away then my violin, swung myself up. From the window, I climbed down the old, cracked wall by gripping the bushes, sprouting from the cracks with my hands. But some rotting bricks gave way, sending me slipping faster and faster until finally both feet hit the ground with a thud, causing a jolt through my skull. As I made it to the garden's bottom in this manner, someone embraced me with such force that I let out a loud scream. The good friend quickly silenced me by pressing his fingers to my mouth, took my hand, and led me out of the bushes into the open air. There, I recognized with surprise the good, tall student who was hanging his guitar on a wide silk band around his neck. I then described to him at top speed that I wanted to leave the garden. He seemed to have known this for a long time and led me through various hidden routes to the lower gate in the high garden wall. However, the gate was once again firmly locked. But the student had also anticipated this. He produced a large key and opened it carefully. As we stepped outside into the woods and I was about to ask him the best way to the nearest town, he suddenly knelt before me, raised his hand high, and began cursing and swearing in a horrifying manner. I didn't know what he wanted. All I heard was "idiot" and "glut" and "glove" and "Führer." As he kept sliding closer and faster to me on both knees, I suddenly felt terror grip me. I realized he was insane and ran looking without getting back into the thickest forest. I could hear the student screaming frantically behind me soon. Another gruff voice from the castle responded. I thought they might come to look for me. The path was unfamiliar, the night dark, and I could easily fall back into their hands. So I climbed to the top of a tall fir tree to wait for a better opportunity. From there I heard voices waking up one by one at the castle. Some torches appeared at the top, casting their wild red lights across the old castle walls and far into the black night from the mountain. I committed my soul to the dear God as the chaotic din grew louder and approached closer. Eventually the student with a torch passed beneath my tree, his cloak flapping in the wind. Then it seemed they all moved towards another side of the mountain. The voices echoed further and further away, and the wind whistled through the silent forest once more. I quickly climbed down from the tree and ran faster than ever into the valley and night. 7th chapter. I had hurried on day and night. For a long time something had been pounding in my head. Here is the English translation of the text, while preserving the name Eichendorff in my ears, as if they came from the mountain with their calls, with torches and long knives still following me. On my journey, I learned that I was only a few miles from Rome. Then I felt an intense joy, for I had already heard many wonderful stories at home as a child about the splendid Rome, and when on Sunday afternoons I lay in the grass before the mill, with everything around so still, I imagined Rome like the passing clouds above me, with wondrous mountains and abysses by the blue sea, golden gates, and tall gleaming towers from which angels sang in golden robes. The night was already far advanced, and the moon shone brightly as I finally emerged onto a hill from the forest and suddenly saw the city in the distance before me. The sea sparkled in the distance, the sky blazed and flickered with countless stars. Beneath lay the holy city, from which one could only make out a long strip of fog, like a sleeping lion on the still earth, and mountains stood beside it like dark giants guarding it. I first came upon a vast, solitary heath, where it was so grey and quiet as in a grave. Only back and forth stood an old, crumbling building or a dry, wonderfully twisted bush. Sometimes night birds flew through the air, and my own shadow stretched constantly long and dark alongside me in the solitude. They say that here lies an ancient city and the goddess Venus buried, and sometimes the old heathens still rise from their graves and walk across the heath in silent nights, confusing the travellers. But I continued straight ahead unperturbed, for the city rose increasingly clear and splendid before me, and the high castles and gates and golden domes gleamed so beautifully in the bright moonlight, as if the angels were indeed standing on the battlements, dressed in gold and singing into the still night. So at last I passed by small houses, then through a magnificent gate into the famous city of Rome. The moon shone between the palaces as if it were daytime, but the streets were already empty. Here and there a wretched fellow lay like a corpse on the cool marble steps and slept. Meanwhile the fountains murmured in the quiet squares, and the gardens along the street rustled and filled the air with refreshing scents. As I am just continuing my walk, enjoying the moonlight and perfumed air, not knowing in which direction to turn, suddenly a guitar is heard from deep within one of the gardens. My God, I think that must be the crazy student with the long cloak secretly following me. A lady started singing most beautifully in the garden as a result. I stood entranced, for it was the voice of the beautiful, gracious woman, and the same Welsh song she often sang at home by the open window. Then all of a sudden I noticed the beautiful in olden Zeiten drang dies Erinnerung so stark in mijn hers, das ich bitterlich, ich ret wein me gender still, gaten voor dem sloos by, fra hem morgenlit, and why ich dort hinter dem stroch so go kaxilig war, beaver die dum vlieg meer in die neesvlog. Ich kantet mich nit leder nenger halten, ich kletterte W, berdaz vergel de gitter, an schwang mich heinab in den Garten gaher, wo der Gesang kam. De bemerkte ich ein Slank, we gestelt, die aus der Fern hinter einer Pappel stand, und mich erst verwundert answer, als ich über das Gitter kletterte, den aber plötzlich so schnell durch den dunklen Garten nach dem Haus flog, dass man sie im Mondlicht kaum erkennen konnte. Das war sei selbst, rief ich aus an mein Hers erschlug vor Früd, denn ich erkennt sei sofort an ihren kleinen, zierlichen Fersen en. Is war nur skade, dass ich mir beim abspringen vom Garten ter den rechten Pfaffen ihn wenig verdret heit, also must ich in eich mail mit dem Bein wippen. Bevor ich zum Haus springen konnte, aber in der Zwischenzeit hatten sei Tor und Fenster fest verschlossen. Ich kloft bescheiden, lost und kloft ernert. Es war, als we rede man im inneren Feilstern und Kitchen, einmal kam es mir sogar vor, als we reden zwischen den Jalousien zwei Halogen im Mondlicht funkeln. Dann wird wieder als still. Ich dachte, sei weit nicht, dass ich es bin. Ich holt mein Geige heraus, da ich immer bei mir trug, und slendert auf, und ab entlang des Ganges vor dem Haus, spielt sang das, Leid von der so nenfrol und spielt voller Friud, Lieder, ich damals in den Wonders, nen sommen in Chitten im Schitzlossgarten oder auf, deck dem Bangver Solhaus, gespielt heit, so dass es bis zu den Fenstern des Schlosses hen bezu he ren war. Aber als Hafnitz niemand hört sich im ganzen Haus. Schlittlet ich mein Gage traurig besit an Lech auf die Schwell vor der Hausste, denn ich war semem die vom Langen Marsch. Die Nacht war warm, die Blumenbeet vor dem Haus dufteten herrlich, und ein wasser Speil, anten im Garten plattestörtest endig was sich hin. Ich träe am Wand himmelblauen Blumen, Wonschen Dunkelgrün nen, insemen wiesen wo quillen rosten an be clean ply tetraten, an bunte wie gelwandert Schansengen, bis ich lichfest einschlief. Als ich aufwatchet, stra meti die morgenluft durch o glied machen en, die wie gelweren berits watch an zwitschurten auf den be dibjumen mitchherem, als wollten sie mich vor jeinen Narren halten. Ich sprang schnell auf an, sah mich, das Wasserspiel im Garten plattete noch immer, aber im Haus war keine Lotzuren. Ich stand durch die großen Jalousien in das ein Zimmer. Da stand ein Sofa und ein großer runder Tisch mit einer Leinwand als Tischdeck. Da saß die Hellstanden all ordentlich und den W nenden. Von außen waren jedoch die Jalousien in allen Fenstern heruntergelassen, so als wir wie das Haus sieht, vielen Jahren unbewohnt. A sudden wave of considerable dread overcame me at the sight of the solitary house and garden and of the white figure of yesterday. I ran through the silent arcades and passages without looking back, quickly climbing up again to the gate. But there I sat entranced as I suddenly beheld, through the tall grille-work, the magnificent city spread out below. The morning sun flashed and sparkled far over the roofs, and into the long silent streets, causing me to gasp loudly and leap joyously onto the street. But where should I turn in this strange new city? Still, the confused night and the enchanting song of the kind lady from yesterday were whirring around in my mind. Finally I sat down on the stone fountain that stood in the middle of the deserted square, washing my eyes clear with the cool water and singing. If I were a little bird, I would know what to sing, and if I had 2 wings, I would know where to swing. Well, merry fellow, a young man said suddenly as he approached the fountain while I was singing. You sing like a lark at the first morning ray. I was taken aback by this unexpected encounter in German. It felt much like the bell from my village ringing on a quiet Sunday morning. God welcome, kind sir, I exclaimed and leaped down from the stone fountain with delight. The young man smiled and looked me over from head to toe. But what brings you here to Rome? He finally asked. I was at a loss for an answer, confessing that I had just been following the kind lady would not do. "I'm just exploring," I replied. "Exploring?" The young man echoed, laughing loudly. "Well then, have something in common. That's exactly what I'm doing too, exploring and adding a little colour to the world. So you're an artist?" I exclaimed happily, thinking of Herlian Hart and Guido. But he cut me off. "I think you should come with me," he said, "and have breakfast at my place. I'll paint a portrait of you. It will be a pleasure." That sounded fine to me, so I followed the artist through empty streets where only here and there were windows opened, or a pair of white arms, or a sleepy face peeking out into the fresh morning air. He led me in and out of many confused, narrow, dark alleyways until we finally reached an old smoky house. There we climbed up a dark, winding staircase, as if ascending to heaven. We stood before a door under the roof, and the artist began rummaging through all his pockets with great haste. But he had forgotten to lock up and left the key in the room. He was, as he told me on our journey, out before dawn, exploring the area at sunrise. He simply shook his head and kicked open the door. It was a long, spacious room where one could have danced if it weren't for all the clutter on the floor. Boots, papers, clothes, overturned paint, cans, everything was mixed up. In the middle of the room stood tall scaffolding used for picking pears, and large paintings leaned against the walls all around. On a long wooden table sat a bowl with bread and butter next to a splotch of colour, alongside a bottle of wine. "Now eat and drink, comrade," the painter called out to me. I wanted to spread some butter on a slice right away, but there was no knife to be found. We had to rummage through the papers on the table for quite some time before we discovered one hidden under a large package. The painter then opened the window wide, letting in the fresh morning air that filled the entire room with joy. It was a breathtaking view far beyond the city into the mountains, where the morning sun brightly illuminated the white rural houses and vineyards. Long live our cool, green Germany behind those mountains, the painter exclaimed, raising his glass from the wine bottle he then offered to me. I politely acknowledged his gesture and greeted my distant, beautiful homeland 1,000 times over in my heart. Meanwhile, the painter had moved the wooden scaffolding with a large sheet of paper stretched across it closer to the window. On the paper was a meticulously drawn old hut with a face carefully crafted within its framework. Inside sat the Virgin Mary with an expression that was both charming and sorrowful. At her feet, in a tiny nest of straw, lay the baby Jesus, looking gentle but with serious eyes. Outside, on the threshold of the open hut, knelt 2 shepherd boys with staffs and bags. "Look," the painter said, "I want to put your head on that one shepherd boy over there so people can see you too, and if fate permits, they might still enjoy it even after we're both long buried and standing here just as still and joyful before the mother and her son like these happy boys." He then grabbed an old chair, but as he lifted it, half of the seat came off in his hand. He quickly reassembled it, pushed it towards the scaffolding, and I had to sit on it with my face turned slightly to the side towards the painter. So there I sat for a few minutes, completely still without moving. But I don't know, eventually I couldn't take it anymore. It would itch here and there. Right in front of me hung a broken half mirror that made me keep glancing at it, and out of boredom I'd make all sorts of faces and expressions while the painter painted. Noticing this, he finally burst into loud laughter and waved his hand and signaling for me to look away. Here is the translation of the text. While preserving the name Eichendorff, I had to get up again. My face as a shepherdess was already complete, and it looked so clear that I liked myself very much. He continued diligently in the fresh morning chill, singing a little song at the same time, and occasionally looking out through the open window into the magnificent surroundings. Meanwhile, I sliced off a piece of buttered bread and walked around the room, examining the paintings on the walls. 2 of them particularly pleased me. "Did you paint these as well?" I asked the artist. "Why not?" He replied, "These are by the famous masters Leonardo Vinci and Guido Reni, but you probably don't know that." My response irritated him. "Oh," I said calmly, "I am quite familiar with both of these masters." The painter's eyes widened. "How do you know?" he quickly asked. "Well," I explained, I've traveled with them day and night on horseback, on foot, even in a carriage, so the wind blew through my hat, and I lost them both in an inn, then continued alone in their carriage with extra postal service, driving over terrible stones, while the carriage with the fast, moving horses flew over them on 2 wheels. "Wow! Wow!" interrupted the painter, looking at me intently as if he thought I was crazy. But suddenly he burst into loud laughter. He exclaimed, "Now I understand you traveled with 2 painters named Guido and Leonardo." When I confirmed this, he quickly stood up and examined me from head to toe again. "I believe that at the end," he said, "you play the violin." I struck my jacket, making the violin inside emit a sound. "Well, truly," said the painter, "there was once a German countess here who inquired about the 2 painters, and a young musician with a violin in all corners of Rome." A young German countess? I exclaimed joyfully, "And is the porter included?" "No, I don't know any of that," replied the painter. "I only saw her a few times at a friend's place, but she doesn't live in the city," he continued, suddenly raising a canvas covering a large painting in one corner. It was as if I had opened the curtains in a dark room and suddenly blazed with morning sunlight. In my eyes it was the gracious lady. She stood in a black velvet dress in the garden, lifting her veil with one hand and gazing silently and kindly into a vast, magnificent landscape. The longer I looked, the more it seemed to me that it was the garden at the castle, and the flowers and branches gently swayed in the wind. Deep below, I could see my Tolbooth and the country road stretching through the green, following the Danube. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff and the distant blue mountains. "It is she," I finally exclaimed, grabbed my hat, and rushed out the door, down many steps, only hearing the painter, astonished, calling after me to return in the evening, as we might learn more then. 8th chapter. I ran through the city with great haste to report right away to the garden house where the beautiful woman had sung the night before. Meanwhile, everything on the streets had come alive. Gentlemen and ladies strolled in the sunshine, bowing and greeting each other haphazardly. Magnificent carriages rumbled by, and from every tower the church bells rang for Mass, so that the sounds mingled wonderfully with the crowd in the clear air. I was as drunk on joy and excitement, running straight ahead in my happiness until, finally, I didn't even know where I was. It was as if enchanted. The quiet square with its fountain, garden, and house seemed merely a dream that had vanished back into the earth under the bright sunlight. I couldn't ask any questions because I didn't know the name of the square. Eventually, It also became unbearably muggy, with sunbeams shooting down like burning arrows onto the pavement. People retreated into their homes, and all the shutters were closed everywhere. Suddenly, there was a deathly silence on the streets. In my desperate state, I threw myself down before a beautiful grand house, in front of which a balcony shaded by wide columns cast a long shadow. I gazed at the tranquil city, now looking unexpectedly eerie in the sudden solitude at high noon, and then again at the deep blue sky entirely free of clouds, until I finally dozed off from sheer exhaustion. In the dream that followed, I lay on a solitary green meadow in my hometown. A warm summer rain was spritzing and glistening in the sun as it set behind the mountains. As raindrops fell onto the grass, they turned into a multitude of beautiful, colorful flowers, overwhelming me completely. But when I woke up, to my astonishment, I saw a lot of fresh, beautiful flowers lying around me. I sprang up but noticed nothing out of the ordinary except for a window high up in the house directly above, brimming with fragrant bushes and flowers behind which a parrot kept incessantly talking and screaming. So I gathered the scattered flowers, tied them together, and put the bouquet in my front buttonhole. Then I started chatting with the parrot because it amused me as it climbed up and down in its gilded cage, making all sorts of faces while trodden on its big toe over and over again. Before I knew it, he had called me a scoundrel. Though it was an unreasonable beast, it still irritated me. I scolded him back. We both got heated. The more I scolded in German, the more he retorted in Italian. Suddenly, I heard someone laughing behind me. I quickly turned around. It was the painter from this morning. Here is the English translation while preserving the name Eichendorff. "You're at it again," he said. "I've been waiting for you for half an hour. The air has cooled down, and we're heading to a garden on the outskirts of town. There you'll find several compatriots, and perhaps learn more about the German countess." I was extremely pleased by this, and we set off on our walk, still hearing the parrot scold me from behind. After climbing narrow, rocky paths outside the city for a while between country houses and vineyards, we reached a small garden high up in the hills. Several young men and women were sitting around a round table in the green amidst the buildings. As soon as we entered, everyone waved at us to be quiet and pointed towards the other side of the garden. There, two beautiful women sat across from each other at a table under a large, verdant arbor. One was singing while the other played a guitar along with her. Standing behind them friendly was a man who occasionally tapped out the rhythm with a small stick. The setting sun sparkled through the vine leaves, casting light over the wine bottles and fruits on the table, making it seem like the table in the arbor. One woman's cheeks swelled from the strain of singing in Italian so artificially that she appeared entranced. The other waited for her to return to rhythm. Just then, as the singer paused with eyes looking up to the sky, and the man next to her raised his stick to anticipate when she'd get back into rhythm, no one in the entire garden dared to breathe. A door suddenly flew open, and a girl, hot and flushed, rushed in, followed by a young man with a delicate, pale face. The startled music director stood frozen with his raised stick, though the singer had already stopped her lengthy trill, and stood up angrily. All the others hissed at the newcomers in anger. "Barbarian!" One of them shouted from the round table, "You've run right into this meaningful tableau described by the blessed Hoffman on page 347 of Women's Pocket Book for 1816. of the most beautiful Hammelschimage scene at the Berlin Art Exhibition in the fall of 1810. But nothing availed. "Ha, what does it matter?" replied the young man, with your tableaux of tableaux. "My self-created image for others, and my girl for myself alone, that's how I want it to be." He then resumed his attack on the poor girl, saying, "You faithful one? False one? You critical soul, who only seeks the silver eye in painting and the golden thread in poetry, and has no beloved but only treasures. I wish you had, instead of an honest painter's brush and an old duke with a whole coin mine of diamonds on his nose, bright silver eyes on the bold plate, and gold embroidery on the few remaining hairs." Yes, just get that accursed piece of paper out that you hid from me just now. What have you started again? Whose is this scribble? And who is he? But the girl resolutely pushed back, and as the others eagerly surrounded the angry young man, trying to comfort and soothe him with much noise, his agitation and madness grew greater from the rumour, especially since the girl could not hold her tongue until she finally flew out of the tangled mess, weeping, and suddenly threw herself onto my chest, seeking shelter with me. I immediately took the appropriate position, but as the others were not paying attention to us in the midst of the commotions, she turned her head towards mine and whispered into my ear very quietly and quickly, "You despicable intruder, I have to endure all this for you. Here, take this fateful note on it. You'll find our address. So, at the specific hour when you arrive at the gate, always take the lonely road to the right." I was speechless in wonder, indeed, as I looked at her more closely. I recognized her. She was the sharp-tongued chambermaid from the castle who had brought me a bottle of wine on that beautiful Sunday evening. She had never seemed so beautiful to me before as she did now, leaning into me so heatedly that her black curls hung over my arm. "But, dear miss," I said in astonishment. "Oh, did you?" "For heaven's sake, be quiet now," she replied, and quickly sprang from me to the other side of the garden before I could fully comprehend everything. In the meantime, the others had almost forgotten their initial topic, but they continued to argue pleasantly among themselves, trying to prove to the young man that he was actually drunk, which would not have been befitting for an honourable painter. The round, fixed man from the pavilion who, as I later learned, was a great connoisseur and friend of arts and sciences, and loved to participate in everything out of love for knowledge, had also thrown away his cane and eagerly flanked in the midst of the thickest commotion, trying to mediate and calm things down while lamenting between breaths the long cadence and beautiful tableau he had arranged with much effort. But my heart was as clear as on that blessed Saturday when I played the violin at an open window in front of a bottle of wine until deep into the night at our lonely forest castle. I took up my violin again, as the rumour showed no signs of stopping, and played a Welsh dance they danced in the mountains, which I had learned at that old, solitary forest castle. Everyone's head snapped up. "Bravo, bravissimo! A delightful idea!" cried the cheerful art connoisseur, immediately running from one to another to organize a rural divertissement, as he called it. He himself took the lead by offering his hand to the lady who had earlier played in the pavilion. He had started to dance, an extraordinary artificial dance, writing various letters with his toes on the grass, striking proper trills with his feet, from time to time making quite acceptable jumps in the air. But he soon grew tired, as he was somewhat corpulent. He made shorter and less skilled jumps, until he finally stepped completely out of the circle, coughing violently and wiping the sweat off his face with his snow white handkerchief. Meanwhile, the young man, now once again filled with fear, had brought castanets from the inn, and before I knew it, everyone under the trees was dancing chaotically. The setting sun still cast some red glimmers among the dark shadows, and over the old building and the wild ivy covered half-submerged columns at the back of the garden, while from the other side, deep in the vineyards, one could see the city of Rome lying bathed in the evening glow. There they all danced gracefully amidst the greenery and the clear, still air, and my heart laughed within me as the slender girls and the maid waiting among them, with their arms raised high, swayed like pagan forest nymphs between the leaves, clicking happily on their castanets each time they leapt into the air. I could not hold back any longer. I sprang right into the middle of them while continually playing my violin, making proper figures. It seemed that for a considerable time I had been jumping around in circles without noticing that the others were growing tired and gradually drifting away from the grass plot. Then someone pulled me roughly by the back of my coat from behind. It was the maid in waiting. "Don't be foolish," she whispered. "You're jumping like a goat. Study your note properly and come soon. The beautiful young countess is waiting." And with that, she slipped out through the garden gate in the twilight and was soon lost among the vineyards. My heart pounded. I would have liked to spring after her immediately. Fortunately, as it had already gotten dark, the way to lit a large lantern at the garden door. I approached and quickly pulled out the note. There, with a quill, the gate and the road were sketched just as the maid in waiting had told me earlier. It said, "At 11 o'clock at the little door." There were still many long hours ahead. Nonetheless, I wanted to set off immediately because I could not rest. But then the painter who had brought me here approached me. "Did you speak to the girl?" he asked. "Can't see her anywhere now." She was the maid in waiting of the German countess. "Hush, hush," I replied. "The countess is still in Rome." "Well then, all the better," said the painter. "Come and drink to her health with us." And so, despite my resistance, he dragged me back into the garden. By this time it had become boring and empty. The merry guests strolled off, each with his beloved by his side, towards the city, and one could still hear their chatter through the calm evening among the vineyards, and laughing ever further and further, until finally the voices were lost deep in the valley, within the rustling of the trees and the stream. I was still with my painter and Missa. Eichendorff, that was how the other young painter who had been quarrelling earlier was, enamoured alone upstairs. The moon shone beautifully into the garden between the tall, dark trees. A flicker of light danced in the wind on the table before us and shimmered over the spilled wine on the board. I had to sit down. My painter chatted with me about my origins, my journey, and my life plans. Mr. Eichendorff, however, had the young, pretty girl from the inn, after she placed bottles on our table, sat her down on his lap, put his guitar in her arms, and taught her a little song to play. She soon got used to it with her small hands, and they then sang together an Italian song. He would sing one line, then the girl would, which looked beautiful and peaceful than that quiet evening. When the girl was called away, Miss Eichendorff leaned back on his bench with the guitar, placed his feet on a chair in front of him, and sang many lovely German and Italian songs all by himself, no longer paying attention to us. The stars seemed to sparkle beautifully against the clear sky. The whole area was as if silvered by the moonlight. I thought about the beautiful woman, my distant homeland, and completely forgot my painter next to me. Sometimes Mr. Eichendorff had to sing along, which would make him very angry. He twisted and pulled at the instrument until suddenly a string snapped. He threw down the guitar and stood up. Only then did he realize that my painter had lain his arm on the table while fast asleep. He quickly grabbed a white coat hanging on a nearby branch and realized, looking me straight in the eye for the first time, that I was still there, before settling himself directly in front of me at the table, clearing his throat, adjusting his necktie, and then suddenly starting to speak to me. "Dear listener and fellow countryman," she said, "and the bottles are almost empty, and since morality is undoubtedly the first civic duty when virtues wane, I feel compelled out of fellow countryman sympathy to impart some morality to you. One might think," he continued, "that you are a mere youth while your coat is past its best years. One might assume that you had strange fits like a satyr earlier, and indeed some may even claim that you are merely a vagabond because you are in the countryside playing the fiddle, but I do not pay attention to such superficial judgments. I stick to your sharp nose. I consider you a refined genius." The insincere expressions annoyed me, and I was just about to reply when he stopped. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Eichendorff. "He cannot put my thoughts into words," he said. "You see how you're already swelling with pride from this little praise. Go within yourself and consider this dangerous profession. With genius essifer, I am one to make no more of the world than they do, nor does the world make of us. Rather, we stride on in our 7-league boots, which we will soon carry into the world, straight towards eternity. Oh, most pitiable, awkward, spread, eagled position, with one leg in the future, where nothing but dawn and future children's faces intervene, and the other still in Rome on the Piazza del Popolo, where the entire millennium is eager to take part at this good opportunity and cling to the boot tightly that they might tear off your leg. And all this fidgeting, drinking, and hunger merely for eternal immortality. And see my dear colleague there on the bench, he too a genius. Time is already too long for him. What will he begin in eternity? Yes, dear esteemed colleague, you and I and the sun rose together this morning and brooded and painted all day, and it was all beautiful, and now the sleepy night with its fur collar is sweeping over the world and has blurred all the colors. He continued speaking, his disheveled hair giving him a pale, ghostly appearance from dancing and drinking under the moonlight. I had been uneasy about him for some time and his wild ramblings, and as he turned towards the sleeping painter, I seized the opportunity to slip away unnoticed around the table in the garden and descend alone and joyful into the vast valley bathed in moonlight. From the city the clocks struck 10. Behind me I heard faint guitar melodies and sometimes the voices of the two painters as they made their way home. So I ran as fast as I could to avoid further questions. Turning abruptly at the gate, I took a right into the street and hurried past silent houses and gardens with my heart pounding. But what astonished me was finding myself suddenly on the square with the fountain, something I hadn't even noticed during the day. There stood the lonely garden house once again, bathed in the most exquisite moonlight, and the beautiful woman sang her Italian song in the garden, just as she had yesterday evening. I ran in delight first to the small door, then to the main door, and finally with all my might at the large garden gate, but it was locked. Only then did I realize it wasn't yet 11 o'clock. I was annoyed by the slow passage of time, but I didn't want to climb over the fence as I had yesterday because of my good manners. So I walked up and down for a while on the deserted square and eventually sat down again on the stone fountain, deep in thought and silent anticipation. The stars sparkled in the sky and on the square. Everything was quiet and still, and I listened with great pleasure to the song of the beautiful lady that floated over from the garden as the fountain gurgled. Suddenly, and I noticed Figure White approaching from the other side of the square, heading straight for the small garden door. I focused through the moonlight and realized it was the eccentric painter in his white cloak. He quickly pulled out a key, unlocked the door, and before I knew it, he was inside the garden. From the very start, I had felt an unusual dislike for the painter due to his senseless talk. But now my anger reached its peak. I thought to myself, the wretched genius is definitely drunk again. He must have stolen the key from the chambermaid and plans to steal, betray, or assault the kind lady. So I burst through the small gate into the garden. As I entered, a profound silence enveloped me. The gate leading to the garden house stood open, casting a milky white glow that danced across the grass and flowers in front. I peered inside cautiously. There she lay, the beautiful lady of grace, in a lovely green chamber barely illuminated by a white lamp, with a guitar in her arms on a silk couch, unaware of any potential dangers outside. But my gaze didn't linger for long as I noticed the white figure stealthily moving behind the bushes towards the garden house. The lady's mournful song echoed out, piercing through me. I didn't hesitate. I snapped off a sturdy branch and ran straight at the white-cloaked figure, yelling at the top of my lungs, "Murderer!" The entire garden shook with the force of my cry. Startled by my sudden appearance, the painter took off running and screamed in terror. I matched his pace, but just as I was about to catch up, my feet got tangled in the fatal floral arrangements, and I tumbled headlong towards the front door. "So you're the fool," I heard someone shout above me. "You almost gave me a heart attack." I quickly regained my composure, and as I brushed off the sand and dirt from my eyes, there stood the chambermaid before me, her white cloak hanging off one shoulder, which she had lost during her last leap. "But," I exclaimed in disbelief, wasn't the painter here? She retorted sarcastically, "Of course he was, at least his cloak. He put it on me when I passed by the gate earlier, because I was cold." Above the chatter, the gracious lady joined us by the door. My heart pounded wildly. Then, to my horror, I realized that instead of the beautiful lady, I was facing a complete stranger. She was a tall, robust woman with a proud eagle-like nose. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff, with arching black eyebrows, so strikingly beautiful as to be frightening. She gazed at me with her large, sparkling eyes in a majestic manner, leaving me speechless with awe. I was utterly bewildered, continually making compliments, and even wanting to kiss her hand at the end. But she quickly withdrew her hand and spoke in Italian to the chambermaid, which I didn't understand. Meanwhile, the previous shouting had awakened the entire neighborhood. Dogs were barking, children screaming, and men's voices could be heard drawing nearer and nearer to the garden. She looked at me again as if she wanted to pierce me with fiery balls, turned away quickly towards the room while laughing haughtily and awkwardly, and slammed the door in my face. The chambermaid, however, grabbed me without hesitation by the sleeve and dragged me towards the garden gate. "There you go again, doing something incredibly stupid," she said maliciously on her way there. I was getting angry too. "Well, to hell with it," I replied. "Didn't you yourself summon me here?" "That's exactly it," the chambermaid retorted. "My countess meant well for you, throwing flowers at you from the window, singing arias. And this is her reward. There's nothing we can do with you. You're trampling on your luck." "But," I objected, "I'm referring to the countess from Germany, the beautiful noble lady." "Oh?" She interrupted me. "She's long since returned to Germany with your ridiculous love. So go back there. She's been longing for you anyway, so you can play the violin together and look at the moon, but don't ever show up here again." By this time, a terrible rumor and commotion had spread behind us. People from the neighboring garden were hurriedly climbing over the fence with sticks. Others were fleeing and searching through the passages. Desperate faces in sleep caps were peering into the moonlight from various hedges. It seemed as if the devil had suddenly conjured up scoundrels from every hedge and bush. The chambermaid didn't hesitate. "Thea, the thief is running over there," she shouted to the people, pointing towards the other side of the garden. She quickly pushed me out of the garden and closed the gate behind me. I found myself once again standing alone in God's open sky on that silent square, just as I had arrived the day before. The water feature that had amused me so much in the moonlight earlier, as if little angels were ascending and descending within it, continued to flow as before, but all joy and pleasure had left the well for me. I decided then to turn my back forever on false Italy with its mad painters, pomegranates and chambermaids, and walked out of the gate at that very hour. 9th chapter. The loyal mountains stand guard, who slips from a distant land through the hills in still morning light. But the mountains await. Here is the translation of the text while preserving the name Eichendorff. Contemplate and laugh at me with great joy, and call out from your fresh chest, "Long live Austria!" Only then will everyone around recognize me. Now the brook and the birds sing softly, and the forests all around in their regional manner. The Danube glistens from deep below the stay. Stephen's Tower also from afar over the mountain it peaks, and would like to see me too, if then not. Then it will come right away. Long live Austria! I stood on a high mountain where you can look into Austria for the first time, and waved my hat with great delight while singing the final stanza. Suddenly, a magnificent music from wind instruments echoed behind me in the forest. I quickly turned around and saw 3 young men in long blue coats. One played the oboe, another the clarinet, and the third, who had an old 3-valved horn on his head, played the waldhorn. They suddenly accompanied me, making the entire forest resound. Not being too lazy, I took out my violin and began to play and sing with fresh energy. One of them looked at another uncertainly. The waldhorn player then put down his puffy cheeks first and set down his horn until eventually all became silent, watching me. I paused in surprise, looking at them too. "We thought," said the waldhorn player finally, "since he wears such a long coat, that he must be a travelling Englishman admiring the beautiful nature here. We wanted to earn a viatical allowance from him." "But it seems, sir, you are yourself a musician." "Actually, I am a collector," I replied, "and I have come straight from Rome. However, as I haven't collected anything for some time now, I've been supporting myself with my violin on the road." Not much good these days, said the waldhorn player, who had meanwhile retreated to the forest and started a small fire with his 3 valved horn. One such a lord eats calmly at noon, and we unexpectedly enter the domed porch, starting to play from our heart. Soon a servant will pop out with money or food, just to get rid of the noise. But would you like to have a snack with us, sir? The fire crackled merrily in the forest. It was a fresh morning. We all sat down around the grass, and 2 of the musicians took a pot containing coffee and milk from the fire, bringing out bread from their coat pockets and dipping and drinking alternately from the pot. It tasted so good to them that it was a pleasure to watch. The waldhorn player said, "He can't stand this black drink," handing me half of a large buttered slice, then producing a bottle of wine. "Would you like a sip, sir?" I took good pull, but quickly put it down and contorted my face, as it tastes like 3-man wine, said the waldhorn player. But the Lord has had enough. In Italy, they had corrupted German tastes. Upon this, he eagerly rummaged through his satchel and finally pulled out an old, tattered land map, still featuring the emperor in full regalia, holding a scepter in one hand, an imperial apple in the other. He carefully unrolled it on the ground, while the others gathered closer, and they began to discuss their proposed route. "The vacancy will soon be over," said one. "We must turn left from Linz immediately, so we can still make it to Prague in good time." "No, truler," exclaimed the bugler. "To whom do you want to blow your orders?" "Only forests and coal miners, no refined art appreciation, no reasonable free stopover." "Nonsense," replied the other. "The farmers are my favorite people. They know best where the shoe pinches, and they're not so particular when someone occasionally plays a wrong note." "That's true," countered the bugler. "You have no sense of honor. The Latins say, odi profanum vogus et artio." "Well, there should be churches on our journey," suggested a third party, "so let's stay with the gentlemen priests." "Most obedient servant," said the bugler. "They give small change and big sermons, urging us not to waste time aimlessly wandering about, but rather to apply ourselves to science, especially, they sense, in me the future fellow monk. No clericus clericum non decimat. But what really matters? The professors are still sitting in Carlsbad and don't even keep the day strictly." "Indeed," agreed the other. "Distinguendum est inter et inter. What is allowed for Jupiter is not allowed for a cow." I then realized these were Prague students, and they commanded my respect, all the more since their Latin flowed as naturally as water from their mouths. "Is the gentleman also an academic?" asked the bugler of me. Humbling myself, I replied that I always had a particular desire to study, but lacked the funds. "That doesn't matter," exclaimed the bugler. "Neither have money nor rich friends, but a clever head must know how to help itself. Aurora musis amicae in English, with many breakfasts. You should not waste your time. But when the noon bells ring out from tower to tower and mountain to mountain over the city, and suddenly the students burst out of the old dark college in a great uproar, and spread through the sunlit streets, then we head for the Capuchins with Father Kitchen Master, where we find our covered table. If it's not covered, there is still a full pot for each of us, so we don't ask many questions after that, and eat, while perfecting our Latin conversation in the process. The gentleman will see we continue studying from one day to the next. And when finally the vacancy arrives, and the others go off to their parents by coach and horseback, we pack our instruments under our mantles and wander through the streets out of the gate. The whole world stands open to us. I don't know. I told him as he spoke so eloquently, it really went through my heart that such learned people should be so completely alone in the world. I thought of myself and how it would be no different for me, and tears came to my eyes. The forest horn player looked at me intently. "Theta doesn't matter," he continued. "I don't want to travel like this. Horses, coffee, fresh made beds, nightcaps, and boot boys ordered in advance. That's the most beautiful part, when we step outside early in the morning and watch the migrating birds fly high above us. You don't even know which chimney is smoking for us that day, and we can't predict what special fortune might meet us before evening." "Wes," said the other man, "and wherever we go and take out our instruments, everything becomes joyful. And when we enter a country manor at noon and play in the entrance hall, the maids dance together in front of the door, and the lord has the salon door slightly ajar, so they can better hear the music inside. Through the gap comes the clatter of plates and the smell of frying, pulling the joyous sound into the hall. The young ladies by the table nearly twist their necks to see the musicians outside." "Truly," exclaimed the forest horn player with glowing eyes, while others repeat their compendiums. "We study in the great picture book that dear God has opened for us outdoors. Yes, believe me, Lord, we shall become the very right kind of men, the ones who can tell the farmers something and hit the pulpit with a fist so hard that the finches below feel their hearts burst with awe and consternation." As they spoke, I felt such merriment in my mind that I too would have liked to study. I couldn't get enough of listening, for I enjoy conversing with learned people where one can gain something. But a real reasonable discussion could not come about. One student had become anxious earlier because the vacation was ending so soon. He therefore quickly put together his clarinet, laid a sheet of music on his knee, practiced a difficult passage from a mass he was to play when they returned to Prague. There he sat, fingering and humming between breaths, sometimes playing so badly that it cut through one's bones, and one often couldn't understand their own words. Suddenly the forest horn player shouted with his deep voice, "Got it?" "That's it." He happily tapped on the map next to him. The other man took a moment off from his diligent playing, looking at him in surprise. "Listen," said the horn player. "Not far from Vienna is a castle, and there's a porter at the castle, and he's my cousin. Dearest fellow students, we must go there, pay our respects to Lord Cousin, and he will take care of how we get on from here." When I heard this, I quickly set off. "Isn't he playing the faggot?" I called out. "And is he of a long, straight shape with a large, distinguished nose?" The forest hornist nodded in agreement. I embraced him in joy that his shamelessness had fallen from his head, and we immediately decided to all go down the Danube by ship to the castle of the beautiful countess together. When we reached the shore, everything was already prepared for departure. The fat innkeeper who had hosted us overnight stood broad and comfortable in his doorway, filling it completely, and let fly various jokes and sayings as farewell, while each window displayed a young girl's face peeking out and nodding cheerfully at the sailors who were just carrying the last packages aboard. An elderly gentleman with a grey overcoat and black necktie, who also wanted to travel, stood on the shore and spoke animatedly, with a slender young man sitting gracefully on a magnificent English horse in front of him, dressed in long leather trousers and a tight scarlet jacket. To my great surprise, it seemed as if they were occasionally glancing at me and speaking about me. In the end, the old gentleman laughed. The slender young man snapped his whip, and they both galloped through the morning air, competing with the larks above, into the sparkling landscape. Meanwhile, the students and I had pooled our money together. The captain laughed and shook his head as the forest hornist recounted all of our fare in loud copper coins, which we had gathered from every pocket with great difficulty. But then I burst out laughing when I suddenly saw the Danube once again right before me. We quickly climbed aboard the ship. The captain gave the signal, and off we went, gliding down between mountains and meadows in the most beautiful morning light. Birds were chirping in the forest, and from both sides came the distant tolling of church bells from the villages, while at times you could hear larks singing overhead. A canary bird was celebrating on board the ship, flitting around joyously. It was a sight to behold. It belonged to a pretty young girl who was also traveling by ship. She had her cage right next to her, and on the other side she held a neat bundle of laundry under her arm. She sat there quietly by herself, looking quite contented, as she sometimes looked at her new travel shoes peeking out from under her skirt, and again down into the water in front of her. The morning sun gleamed down on her white forehead, where she had neatly brushed her hair back. I could tell that the students would have liked to engage her in a polite conversation, as they always passed by her, but the forest hornist cleared his throat and adjusted his necktie or his shamelessness alternately. However, they lacked courage, and every time they got closer she would lower her gaze. Above all, they were embarrassed before the elderly gentleman with the grey overcoat who was sitting on the other side of the ship. They took him for a cleric. He had a breviary before him in which he read, but often looked up at the beautiful surroundings of the book, whose gilded edge and many colourful holy images shone brilliantly in the morning light. In doing so, he also noticed what was happening on board, and soon recognized the birds by their feathers. It didn't take long for him to engage one of the students in Latin, upon which all three approached, removed their hats before him, and responded in Latin. Meanwhile, I had sat right at the front on the peak of the ship, letting my legs dangle over the water, and gazed into the blue distance as the ship flew along, the waves roaring beneath me, always further away, like a tower and castle emerging from the green shore, growing larger and larger before finally disappearing behind us. If only I had wings today, I thought, and finally pulled out my beloved violin to play all my oldest pieces, which I had learned both at home and the beautiful lady's castle. Suddenly, someone tapped me on the shoulder from behind. It was the cleric, who had put his book aside and been listening to me for some time. He laughed, addressing me. "Hello, Daddy Magister, you forget to eat and drink." He then asked me to put away my violin so we could share a snack together, leading me to a small, charming gazebo that the sailors had constructed from young birches and pine trees in the middle of the ship. There he had had a table set up, and I, along with the students and even the young girl, had to sit on barrels and packages around it. The cleric then took out a large roast and buttered bread, carefully wrapped in paper, pulled several wine bottles in a silver goblet lined with gold inside from a case, poured drinks for each of us, tasted them first, sniffed them, and again checked their quality before passing them around. The students sat upright on their barrels, eating and drinking only sparingly out of great reverence. The girl, meanwhile, dipped just the tip of her nose into the goblet, looking shyly at me now and then, and at the students, but the more she looked, the bolder she became. Finally, she told the cleric that this was her first time away from home, and that she had just set off for the castle of her new lord. I turned red all over. She referred to it as the castle of the gracious lady. So that's going to be my future maid of honor, I thought, gazing at her with awe, almost losing my balance in the process. A grand wedding is set to take place at the castle soon, said the cleric. Wes, replied the girl, eager for more details. It is said that there was an old secret love affair, but the countess would never admit it. The cleric only hummed in response, while filling his hunting cup, and with thoughtful expressions I sipped from my glass, but I had stretched myself wide across the table with both arms to listen carefully to the conversation. The spiritual gentleman noticed this and continued. He can tell you, he said again, that the two countesses have sent me on an errand to see if the bridegroom might already be in these parts. A lady from Rome has written that he left a long time ago. As he began speaking of the lady from Rome, I felt my face flush. Does your honor know the bridegroom? I asked, utterly confused. No, replied the old gentleman, but he is said to be quite amusing. Oh, yes, I quickly responded, a bird that breaks out of its cage as soon as it can and sings joyfully when it's free again. And he wanders about in foreign lands, the Lord, continued casually, out at night, Gassetum, and sleeps by day in front of people's doors. This displeased me greatly. Reverend sir, I exclaimed hotly, that is not how you've been informed. The bridegroom is a moral, slender, hopeful young man who lived in great style in an old palace in Italy, mixing with all sorts of countesses, famous painters and chambermaids. Who knows how to manage his money well, if only he had sun. Well, I didn't know you knew him so well, the spiritual gentleman interrupted, laughing heartily until his face turned blue and tears rolled down his cheeks. The girl spoke up again. I heard that the bridegroom is a tall, extremely wealthy lord. Ah, God, yes, indeed. Nothing but confusion, cried the spiritual gentleman, still laughing so hard he could barely speak, until he finally coughed up a chunk of phlegm. He raised his glass and toasted, "May the couple live happily ever after." I didn't know what to make of the spiritual gentleman and his talk, but I was ashamed to tell him here, in front of everyone, that I myself was the lost, happy bridegroom due to the stories from Rome. The glass went around again, and the spiritual gentleman spoke kindly to everyone, so soon everyone liked him, and everything became jumbled and cheerful. The students also grew more talkative, telling tales of their mountain journeys until they finally brought out their instruments and started playing merrily. Cool air from the water trees swept through our branches as the evening sun goldened the forests and valleys flying by us at breakneck speed, while the shore resounded with echoes of forest horns. And when the spiritual gentleman, growing ever happier with each note and tale of his youth, how he had travelled over mountains and valleys during vacation times, and often hungry and thirsty but always cheerful, and how essentially student life was a great vacation between the cramped, dark school and the serious work then they drank to him. Here is the translation of the text. Preserving the name Eichendorff, the students roamed around once more and then eagerly began to sing a song that echoed far into the mountains. Now southward fly all the little birds, Many cheerful wanderers sway, their hats in the morning glow. Those are the gentlemen students on their way out through the gate, playing on their instruments they blow a valediction. Farewell to length and breath, O Prague. We're setting off into the distance. Night falls as we wander through the town. Windows gleam far away. Many people by the window turn and sway, immaculately cleaned. We play before the doors and quench our thirst that comes from all this music, making innkeeper a fresh drink. And lo, over a tiny dwelling with a pitcher of wine, blessed is he. Now cold Boreas blows through the forests. We glide across the fields, wet from rain and snow. My coat flies in the wind, my shoes are torn, so quickly do we blow and sing. Blessed is he who sits in his home, and after the forge, and has good peace. The ship's boy and the girl, though none of us understood Latin, still joyfully joined in with the final verse each time. I was the happiest of all, for I saw my custom house in the distance, and soon afterwards the castle emerged from the evening sun over the trees. 10th chapter. The ship ran aground, and we quickly leapt ashore, dispersing into the green fields like birds when a barn door is suddenly opened. The spiritual gentleman bid us an urgent farewell and strode purposefully towards the castle. In contrast, the students set off eagerly for a secluded bush, where they quickly brushed their coats, washed in the rushing brook, and one would shave another. Finally, the new chambermaid went to the inn beneath the castle hill, accompanied by her canary and a bundle under her arm, to obtain a better dress from the landlady, whom I had recommended as a good person, before presenting herself at the castle above. The beautiful evening filled my heart with light, and when everyone had scattered, without hesitation I ran towards the lordly garden. My custom house, which I had to pass by, stood in its old place. The tall trees from the lordly garden still rustled overhead. A goldfinch that used to sing its evening song on the chestnut tree before my window at sunset sang once more, as if nothing had changed since then. The window of the customs house was open, filled with joy. I peered inside. There was no one present, but the wall clock ticked steadily on. The desk stood by the window, and a long pipe lay in a corner just as it used to. I couldn't resist. I leapt through the window and sat down at the desk before the large arithmetic book. Once again, sunlight filtered through the chestnut tree before the window onto the numbers in the open book. Bees buzzed around. Again, at the open window, the goldfinch sang merrily outdoors on the tree. All of a sudden, though, the door to the room swung open, and an old, tall man entered wearing my checked nightgown. He stood frozen in the doorway as he unexpectedly caught sight of me, quickly removed his glasses, and glared at me sternly. I was not a little startled. I jumped up without saying a word, ran out through the front door into the small garden, where I would have soon gotten my feet entangled in the fatal potato vines that the old man had now planted, following the porter's suggestion instead of my flowers. I could still hear him cursing as he went back outside and scolded after me, but I was already sitting on top of the high garden wall, my heart pounding as I gazed into the palace garden. There was a scent and shimmering and jubilation from all the little birds. The squares and paths were empty, but the golden-topped trees bowed gently in the evening wind, as if welcoming me, and to the side, deep down in the valley, the Danube occasionally glimmered through the trees towards me. Suddenly, I heard singing in the garden a few paces away. Be silent, human desire. Rustle the earth like a dream's wonder with every tree. Things that the heart barely knows old time's gentle sorrow, and let soft shivers drift through the chest, weather lit. The voice and song seemed so strange, yet so familiar to me, as if I had heard them in a dream before. I pondered for a long time. "That's Mr. Godot," I exclaimed joyfully, jumping down into the garden quickly. It was the same song he had sung on that summer evening on the balcony of the Italian tavern where I had seen him last. He continued singing while I leapt over flower beds and hedges following the melody. As I emerged between the last rose bushes, I suddenly froze in place, entranced. Seated on the green patch by the swan pond, bathed in the evening glow, was the gracious lady, dressed in a splendid gown and a wreath of white, and red roses in her black hair, with her eyes cast down, sitting on a stone bench, playing with her riding crop before her on the grass, as she had done then on the boat when I sang that song for her. Across from her sat another young lady, her brown curls full against my face, while she sang to her guitar as the swan slowly swam in circles on the still pond. Then, suddenly, the gracious lady lifted her eyes and shrieked loudly upon seeing me. The other lady quickly turned towards me, her curls flying into her face, and when she looked at me, she burst into an uncontrolled laugh, jumped up from the bench, and clapped her hands 3 times. At that very moment, a large group of small girls in white, short dresses with green and red ribbons peeking between the rose bushes, I couldn't fathom where they all had been hidden. They held a long garland of flowers in their hands, quickly forming a circle around me, dancing around me and singing, "We bring you the maiden's crown. With violet, blue silk, we lead you to joy and dance, to new wedding bliss." Beautiful green maiden's crown, violet, blue silk. This was from the Frisch Cheese. Among the little singers, I recognized some again. They were girls from the village. I pinched their cheeks and would have loved to escape the circle, but the little mischievous things wouldn't let me. I didn't even know what the story meant, and stood there completely bewildered. Suddenly, a young man in fine hunter's attire emerged from the bushes. I scarcely believed my eyes. It was cheerful Mr. Leonhard. The little girls opened the circle, and all at once they stood like charmed, each on one leg, while stretching the other into the air, holding the flower garlands aloft with both arms above their heads. Mr. Leonhard took the kind lady's hand, leading her to me, and said, "Lovian, this all scholars agree is one of the bravest qualities of the human heart. Crumbling fortresses of rank and status with a single glance, making the world seem too narrow and eternity too short. Yes, it is actually a poet's cloak that every fantasist wraps around themselves in the cold world to migrate to Arcadia. And the further apart two beloved lovers wander, the more elegant the wind blows their shimmering cloak behind them, the bolder and more surprising its fold develops, and the longer and longer it grows behind the lovers, such that a neutral person cannot travel without accidentally stepping on one of these trails. Dearest Mr. Bridegroom, although you rush in this cloak to the shores of the Tiber, your current bride's small hand held you at the very end of the train, and as you twitched, played, and rustled, you had to return to her silent spell of captivating eyes. And now, since it has come to pass, you two dear the people, wrap the blessed cloak around yourselves, so that the whole other world disappears around you. Love each other like rabbits and be happy." Mr. Leonhard barely finished his speech when the other young lady, who had earlier sung the little song, approached me. She quickly placed a fresh myrtle crown on my head and sang playfully while securing it in my hair and pressing her face close to mine. Therefore I am loyal to you. Therefore your head is adorned, because the arrow of your bow has often delighted my heart. Then she stepped back. Take a few steps back. Do you still remember the robbers who shook you from the tree that night? She said, giving me a little bow and looking at me so gracefully and happily that my heart laughed inside. Then she walked around me without waiting for my answer. Indeed, he's still the same old guy, without any strange undertone. She suddenly exclaimed, the beautiful, kind lady, Violaine laundry, barber knife, and travel case, everything mixed up. She turned me this way and that, unable to control her laughter. The beautiful, kind lady, meanwhile, remained silent all along, not wanting to meet my eyes out of shame and confusion. It often seemed to me as if she secretly resented the constant chatter and joking. Finally, tears burst from her eyes, and she hid her face in the other lady's chest. That woman looked at her with surprise first, then embraced her warmly. As for me, I stood there bewildered. The more closely I examined the strange lady, the clearer it became it was indeed no one but young Mr. Painter Godot. I didn't know what to say, and just as I was about to ask further questions, Miss Leonhard approached her and spoke in secrets. Does he still not know? I heard him ask. She shook her head. After a moment's pause, he finally said, No, he must learn everything quickly. Otherwise there will only be more gossip and confusion. He turned to me then, Monsieur. Collector, we don't have much time, but do me a favor, get out of here as fast as you can so that later on, through questions, surprises, and head shaking, you won't stir up old stories or come up with new fabrications and guesses. With these words, he pulled me deeper into the bushes. Meanwhile, Miss Flora, who just pretended to know nothing about all this, had exchanged her heart in a flash with someone else. Another man then brought his heart to her again, using prologues, trumpets, and drums, wanting her heart in return. But her heart was already with someone, and that person's heart was with her. He did not want to get his heart back, nor would she give him hers again. The whole world was shouting, but surely you haven't read a novel. I shook my head. Well then, Mr. Leonhard continued, you've played your part in one. In short, it was such a mix-up with hearts that the person, that is to say, I had to place myself at the center. And so, on a warm summer night, I swung onto my horse, took up Miss Flora, as Painter Guido did on another, and off we went towards the south. Here is the translation of the text, preserving the name Eichendorff to hide them in one of my secluded castles in Italy until the outcry over the hearts subsided. But on their way they were tracked down, and Flora suddenly saw our pursuers from the balcony of the Welsh Inn, where you had been sleeping so excellently on guard. So the hunchback signal, there's a spy. We therefore secretly withdrew into the forests and left you to continue your journey alone on the pre-arranged postal route. This missiled our pursuers and also my men at the mountain castle, who had been expecting Flora in disguise every hour and were more eager to serve than sharp-witted, mistaking you for the young lady. Even here at the castle, people believed that Flora lived on the rock. They asked questions, wrote to her, didn't you receive a little note? At these words, I quickly pulled out the paper from my pocket. So this letter, it's addressed to me, said Miss Flora, who had seemed not to pay any attention to our conversation thus far, swiftly tore the note from my hand, read it, and then tucked it into her breast. And now, said the Leonhard, We must hurry to the castle, as everything is waiting for us there. So, in the end, as is only fitting for a well-bred novel discovery, repentance, reconciliation, we are all happily reunited, and the wedding will be the day after tomorrow. As he still spoke, suddenly a spectacle of drums, trumpets, horns, and trombones burst forth from the bushes. Fireworks went off between them, and "Vivat" was cried out. The little girls began to dance again, and head after head emerged from the bushes as if growing up from the earth. I leaped in the midst of the commotion and hustle, but as it grew darker, I recognized all the old faces one by one. The old gardener played the drums. The Prague students in their coats were playing music right in the middle of it. Beside them, the porter was fooling around like a madman on his faggot. As soon as I saw him, I ran to embrace him, and he was completely taken aback. Now truly, if he travels all the way to the ends of the earth, he'll remain a fool. He called out to the students and blew even more angrily. Meanwhile, the noble lady had secretly emerged from the rumour and flew like a startled deer over the lawn deeper into the garden. I saw her just in time and ran after her swiftly. The musicians didn't notice anything in their enthusiasm. Later they thought we had already left for the castle, and the whole gang set off as well, with music and much noise. We, however, had arrived almost simultaneously at a summer house standing on the slope of the garden, with an open window overlooking the vast, deep valley. The sun had long since set behind the mountains, and only a reddish aroma still shimmered over the warm, fading evening, from which the Danube could be heard increasingly clearly rising up. Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the Eichendorff "u." The silence had enveloped everything. I looked intently at the beautiful Countess, who stood right in front of me, visibly out of breath from her run, allowing me to distinctly hear the beat of her heart. I was completely at a loss for words due to my reverence, as we were suddenly alone together. Eventually, I found the courage to take her small, white hand, and she quickly pulled me close, wrapping her arms around my neck, and I embraced her tightly with both mine. But she soon released herself, appearing bewildered, and laid down in the window to cool her flushed cheeks in the evening air. "Oh," I exclaimed. My heart feels like it might burst, but I still can't quite wrap my mind around it. It all seems like a dream. "So does it for me," replied the gracious lady. "Last summer," she added after a moment, "when I arrived from Rome with the Countess, we found Miss Flora and brought her back. And yet I heard nothing about you, never imagined things would turn out this way. It was just at noon today that the jockey, the good, agile young man gasping for breath, rushed onto the property and delivered the news that you were coming by ship." She then let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, do you remember?" she said. "The last time I saw you on the balcony, it was just like today. It was a quiet evening with music in the garden. Who was—" I asked away. I asked hurriedly. "Who?" she replied, looking at me in surprise. "The Lord Husband of Her Grace," I answered, "who was standing on the balcony at the time." She turned crimson red. What an odd thing to say. She exclaimed, "It was the son of the Countess, who had just returned from travel, and it happened to be my birthday when he took me out onto the balcony so I could hear a cheer." "But is that why you left then?" "Oh God, indeed," I cried, hitting myself on the forehead. She nodded her head and laughed heartily. I felt so contented as she chatted merrily and confidingly by my side. I would have listened all night long. I was utterly content, and reached into my pocket for a handful of pistachios that I had brought back from Italy. She took some too, and we cracked them, gazing contentedly out at the silent surroundings. After a while, she said again, "Look," she pointed to a white tea glistening in the moonlight over there. "That's the castle the Count gave us, along with the garden and vineyards. That's where we'll live. He knew our hearts for each other long ago, and has always been kind to you, because if he hadn't taken Miss Flora from the boarding house, they both would have been caught before could ever reconcile with the Countess, and everything would have turned out differently." Here is the translation of the text, while preserving the name Eichendorff. My God, fairest, kindest Countess, I cried out. I don't even know where my head is with all these unexpected news. So, Monsieur Leonhard, yes, she interjected into my speech. That's how he called himself in Italy. He owns those estates over there, and now he's marrying our Countess' daughter, the beautiful Flora. But what do you call me a countess for? I looked at her intently. I'm not even a countess, she continued. Our gracious Countess simply took me into her castle when my uncle, the porter, brought me here as a young child and poor orphan. Now, it was as if a stone had fallen from my heart. God bless the porter, I exclaimed delightedly, that he's our uncle. I always had great respect for him. He means well by you too, she replied, if only you'd act more dignified. He always says, you need to dress more elegantly now. Oh, I cried out joyfully, English tailcoat, straw hat, breeches and spurs. And right after the wedding, we're leaving for Italy, to Rome, where the beautiful water fountains are, and we'll take Prague students in the porter with us. She smiled softly and looked at me with real pleasure and kindness, and from afar music kept playing over and over. Lights flew from the castle through the silent night into the gardens, and the Danube flowed by in between. And everything was good, printed by Breitkopf and Cheik's-Eye Routel in Leipzig. Below are all the changed text lines, with the original line first and the modified line afterwards. And everything was good, printed by Breitkopf and Cheik's-Eye Routel in Leipzig. Below are all the changed text lines, with the original line first and the modified line afterwards.